idiot. I'm so sorry.
All good. Let's take it. Here we go.
I turned everything on. I didn't start the stream.
Hang on, you want me to talk?
No. Yeah, go for it. Yeah, take it away.
Oh, I'm a friend of Kathy's.
Yes.
I'm Australian. I'm an ex-politician, I'm a doctor, and I'm interested in Swiss democracy.
Good.
So I guess that's my, well, it's not a claim to fame, really. That's what Kathy got me here.
And he's a doctor. Medical.
Medical doctor, yeah.
Okay. In case someone falls ill during the vigil, we have someone on.
You can have an opinion.
Yeah. How much is that going to cost?
I'm asking you to make a noise.
You're not a lawyer, sorry.
A big noise. And to keep making a noise until my son is freed. We need to make our protest against this brutality deafening.
can do is become WikiLeaks. So yes, we need to go to the embassy. Yes, we need to protest.
Because
but what we need to do is become the media, which is exactly what Julian has done. He's not only has he become the media, he's done it so well that he has eclipsed their every achievement to infinity. And this is what we have to do. We have to take on that spirit,
whistleblowers,
providing for humanity the services which are not being. And that's what Jimmy Dore is, and Graham Elwood is. It's what all of you. It's what consortium is. It's what all of this truth telling is about.
A coffee? Are you all right? Are you all right, Joe? If I
catch you. Yeah.
Be back in 5?
Yep.
All right.
Just check that desktop audio, I think it's now on.
Yeah, the desktop audio is on.
Yeah, mute it.
Feeling cold now, but got the heater on. Feeling sold out, even though I'm keeping strong. But can I hold out when every bit of freedom's gone? They want me rolled out, never to sing freedom song. I wanna see the sky, I wanna feel the rain, but gotta keep away from windows, that's some window pane. It's just a shame, couldn't have planned out all our dreams. Now I'd scream, cause there's a man in the machine, but the train is off the tracks, and damn, it's losing steam. I wanna call Christine, I haven't seen since 013. I'm missing life like 3 strikes each night. Seems like 3 nights ain't right. Can't fight, space light, hate light, wanting to be snake-like, shedding off this gray life. In the dark can't make light, but where I'm headed now is brake lights. Where I'm headed now they break lights. Counting days like brake lights, feeling weight like brake lights. Had a great life, brake lights, brake lights, brake lights. Out of place like brake lights, in my face like brake lights. Counting days like brake lights, brake lights, brake lights. Sit here asking, what have I done? If these strings were cut, I'd see my son. And if I could just fly from this place, then I'd hold you in my love embrace. And if I could just speak to you now, I'd renew my vow and be in the now.
I'm asking you to make a noise, a big noise, and to keep making a noise until my son is freed. We need to make our protest against this brutality deafening.
I'm speaking to you from the National Press Club in Washington this evening. Julian Assange is a wanted man because he has published classified information given to him by whistleblowers that reveal the crimes and corruption of government officials around the world, not just in the United States. But it is the US, the supposed beacon of freedom and democracy and press freedom, that has indicted him and wants him extradited to the United States for the crime of publishing. He has interfered with the interests of some of the most powerful people in the world by revealing their machinations to the public, and they want him to pay for it. That's why Julian Assange has been a refugee in the Ecuadorian embassy in London for the past 6 years. He knows the second he steps back onto British territory, he'll be arrested and sent to the US, where he's unlikely to receive a fair trial and could very well spend the rest of his life in prison. It's an historic test of press freedom. Though the corporate media, which once profited from him, has now abandoned
speaking now with
Assange.
Tony Kevin.
They could face the same threat to their freedom to publish were he to be arrested and charged. We have some new guests tonight that I'm very happy to introduce to you later on. Now I'm going to read the headlines from the week regarding Julian and WikiLeaks. And the top story is the city of Geneva, the parliament of the city of Geneva voted to grant him asylum. And this is something of a surprise development. I will read to you from a press report from swissinfo.ch. It says the Geneva City Parliament, this was on Wednesday, has adopted a motion demanding that the Swiss government offer asylum to controversial WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. That's the word they used. The somewhat surprising resolution was the result of an hour-long debate on Wednesday evening, framed in the context of providing better protection for whistleblowers. The text was proposed by Eric Bertinat of the conservative Right People's Party, a party not usually known for backing acts of civil disobedience. That's in the words of Social Democrat politician Albani Schlechten. He says that party is not known for supporting civil disobedience. Nevertheless, the proposition picked up enough support from left-wing politicians to withstand opposition from the center-right radical liberals. The People's Party have also tried to push through legislation on the Geneva cantonal level to better protect whistleblowers, while at the federal level in Bern, one of its parliamentarians has raised Assange's case before the Federal Council. At the time, the response of the government about offering asylum to the 47-year-old WikiLeaks founder was negative. He is not a defender of human rights, it said. That's the government council. Assange initially sought asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy in London since 2012 to avoid being extradited to Sweden, where authorities wanted to question him as part of a sexual assault investigation, which has now been dropped. Assange, whose website published thousands of classified U.S. government documents, denied the Sweden allegations, saying the charge was a ploy that would eventually take him to the U.S., where prosecutors were preparing to pursue a criminal case against him. And we now know that case exists, despite Leonie Brinkman, the judge in the Eastern District of Virginia here in the U.S., saying that there's no proof that exists, despite the paragraphs that were inadvertently published from his criminal complaint, which has the words, Assange has been charged. That wasn't enough for the judge to allow the rest of that criminal complaint to become public. She even denied that there's proof that it exists. WikiLeaks released again this week in light of what's happening in Venezuela. One of the documents it published in 2008, which was a manual for regime change, basically. And it focused this part on using banking institutions as, quote unquote, a weapon. And I'm reading from a report in Mint Press by Whitney Webb from 2 days ago. She writes, in a leaked military manual on quote-unquote unconventional warfare recently highlighted by WikiLeaks, the U.S. Army states that major global financial institutions such as the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, are used as unconventional financial, quote, weapons in times of conflict up to and including large-scale general war, close quote, as well as in leveraging, quote, the policies and cooperation of state governments. So this shows the value of WikiLeaks in a current situation, even though this document is 11 years old. It was published 11 years ago by WikiLeaks. It has relevancy to what's going on in Venezuela, where the U.S. has had stringent sanctions against the country, exacerbating an economic crisis to the point where they hope the United States does that the people will rise up against Maduro. And in the meantime, they've decided someone else is president and setting up what could be a civil war, and the possibility of U.S. troops have not entering that war and have not been directly entering that war, have not been taken off the table by the Trump administration. John Bolton was pictured last week holding a yellow legal pad, and when you zoomed in on it, you saw that he wrote 3,000 troops to Colombia, bordering Venezuela. That your imagination can take it the rest of the way if you'd like. This document that WikiLeaks put out 10 years ago, officially titled Field Manual FM 3-05.130, Army Special Operations Forces, Unconventional Warfare, was originally written in September 2008 and highlighted again by WikiLeaks in light of the events in Venezuela. U.S.-led economic siege of that country to sanctions is a form of economic warfare. Again, this is why WikiLeaks is valuable to the public and dangerous to the rulers, because they want to be able to do these things and write about them to themselves without us, the rest of us, who pay the way with our taxes, knowing about it. Clearly, if they're hiding something, it's probably not something above board. The IMF and the World Bank, these are institutions that are supposedly to help the development of countries like Venezuela and other developing countries, but in fact, they can be used as economic war weapons for regime change. Maybe not a surprise. A lot of things WikiLeaks reveals maybe aren't a surprise, but it's the evidence that you need. You might suspect something, but when you have the document that spells it out as clearly as this does, there's no longer any doubt. And that's, again, why WikiLeaks is such a potent and dangerous foe to the ruling circles of this world and friend to the people. It has now been 10 weeks of silence from The Guardian after their ludicrous story published on November 27 of 2018 that Paul Manafort, the one-time and short-time campaign manager for Donald Trump, had visited Julian Assange at the Ecuador embassy in London. There is absolutely no evidence associated with that story, and we know that there would be plenty of it in terms of video surveillance. So he'd have to sign in, leave his passport, etc. People would have seen him, and there's none of that in the story, and none has been produced, despite some pressure being put on The Guardian. They have not said a word about this. I think that they are waiting out the news cycle. In the time we live in now, within 24 hours to 48 hours is a completely new story that the cable news networks are harping on and milking for everything they can get. And what happened a week ago seemed to fade into the background as if it's ancient history. And I think this is The Guardian's thinking. I have no idea. I'm speculating. I also believe this is the same case with BuzzFeed, that wrote a report that Trump had told his lawyer, Michael Cohen, to perjure himself before Congress. That was put out by BuzzFeed. The next day, the Mueller investigation, in a very unusual move, released a public statement saying that that was not accurate. BuzzFeed stuck by their story, and now it's gone, as they imagined it would be within 3. No one's talking about it anymore, which is why I'm raising it, because the story was not proven. It was wrong. They've not taken it down, but our attention spans being as short as they are, they can get away with it, and I think that's what The Guardian is also banking on. On February 4th, 4 days ago, it was the 3rd anniversary of the United Nations' first ruling that WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange is arbitrarily detained by the UK and should be released and compensated. Now, the British government refused by this group, UN group, and with international law, and they fought it. They lost an appeal, and they continue to do what they want, which shows that powers like Britain and the US, when international law is not in their favor, they simply ignore it, since there's really no way to enforce international law except through the UN Security Council, where the US and Britain would both veto any kind of resolution in support of Julian Assange, so it's a non-starter. There are a couple of upcoming events that I want to tell you about, if I could find them on my screen here. Just give me a second. We have coming up on February 11, that is 3 days from now, the Julian Assange debate hosted by George Galloway, former MP, kicked out of the Labour Party, has his own radio show that is being targeted now. The Board of Standards, Journalistic Standards in the UK, is saying that his show doesn't have a diverse opinion, but of course, neither does the BBC or ITV or Channel 4 and their news, and therefore the kinds of people George has on are the ones that aren't on the mainstream, and he's being called out for that. Of course, they don't like the people he has on there because they're not with the establishment point of view, not upholding the status quo that makes lots of people very wealthy and secure and famous, and you don't want to toy with that. That airs at 6:30 p.m. UK time. No, that would be, I guess, in the US. 8:30 p.m. in the UK, and that is on Monday, February 11, 2019. On February 14th in Sydney, Australia, there's an event in a pub called Politics in the Pub in Sydney, and that is called Whistleblowing WikiLeaks and the Future of Democracy, and I'm pleased to say that I will be flying to Sydney to take part in that event. Kathy Vogan could talk a little bit more about that later, since she's organizing this event. On February 23, Julian Assange, quote, will have been detained without charge in the UK for 3,000 days. 3,000 days in what the UN body said was illegal detention. Then on March 3rd in Sydney, again in Sydney, there's a rally to demand Australian government act to free Julian Assange. John Pilger will be speaking at that. That's taking place at Martin Place in Sydney on the 3rd of March. There'll be a similar rally in Melbourne a week later, March 10, and in front of the State Library. Why is the Australian government not acting to free their citizen, Julian Assange? 3,000 days in detention. And we'll get some insight into that by showing an interview that I recorded 2 weeks ago that was played at the end of last Vigil. Maybe a lot of people didn't see it. Certainly our guest didn't get a chance to comment on. I've heard that it has had some impact in Australia. It's a pretty good interview, if I may say so, and I would like Joe Booth to line that up and play it again. And once that's over, it's 20 minutes long, we will bring in our guests, a couple of new faces today, I'm happy to say, and we will discuss that and the issues that I've outlined in my introduction and any other matter that pertains to Julian and WikiLeaks. So Joe, if that's ready, please roll it.
I'm speaking now with Tony Kevin. He's a former Australian senior diplomat and an independent commentator now on foreign affairs. Welcome, Ambassador Tony Kevin, to the Unity for J Vigil. Where are you speaking to us from?
From Canberra in Australia.
You're in Canberra, in the capital. Okay, so thanks again for joining us. You are one of the few former or current government officials anywhere in the world, really, who have spoken out on behalf of Julian Assange. And my question is, when did you first decide to do this and why?
It was shortly after the Bradley Manning disclosures of the terrible massacre from the air in Iraq and the publication of that in WikiLeaks. I became very interested in Julian Assange's positive role in world affairs.
And when did you first make known your views about him, and what was your position at the time?
Oh, from the very beginning, Joe, I was determined to say that this man is performing a public service in the interests of free expression and journalism, and I made that known through my social media opportunities.
While you were still serving the Australian government?
No, I retired in 1998.
What were the reactions from people to your call? Was it all positive or negative, or probably a mix, right?
Julian Assange is a very polarizing figure in Australia. There are people who think he's a traitor to our alliance with the United States, which protects us. And there are people who think that he's a fighter for human rights and freedom. people do fall into those two camps pretty quickly, and I'm in the latter camp, which I'm glad to say seems to be growing.
And the negative reactions, were they quite fierce? Because if you'd stand up for Julian Assange today, it's gotten to be, maybe in those days when you first started, but certainly since the 2016 election in the U.S., the idea is that he somehow was a traitor to the Democratic Party, not to the United States so much. So has that increased your the reactions to you, negative reactions to you?
Yes, it has. It has all got hooked up in the current climate of anti-Trump Russophobia, the determination to see Putin at the in
center of all things.
Yeah, center of all things. There's a wonderful song by Randy Newman about it called Putin, Putin, Putin. And I think it's all gone slightly mad, frankly. I can see no connections between Assange and Russia, unlike some people. I mean, obviously, Ed Snowden has a strong connection with Russia now because they gave him refuge. Fair enough. There's no sign of them having offered or given refuge to Julian Assange. The people who should be protecting him are his own government, Australia.
Well, that leads into my next question. Why have so few government officials, even former ones, come out in his defense? And why isn't the government of Australia doing what you believe, I think, is their legal obligation to protect one of their citizens?
You could also include in your condemnation list there the official Australian opposition party, the Labor Party, which looks set to take government in a very few months because the Liberal Party are now dead men walking. But all of our conventional mainstream politics is very much constrained by the very close strategic alliance with the United States, which now penetrates, rather like Britain, into all areas of our political life. We have a thing called Five Eyes intelligence sharing, which has in recent years become public. It used to be very secret. And under Five Eyes, we have an obligation to share intelligence assessments with the US, Britain, Canada, and New Zealand. Now, there's no legal obligation under Five Eyes to connive in the persecution of Julian Assange, but it creates an enormous background pressure in the minds of our public officials. My gosh, we'd better not do anything to upset the Americans.
But as a government official, they have interests to protect, powerful interests, usually interests even more powerful than their own, behind them. There has to be some part of the thinking, even in Australia, why they don't want to stand up for Assange and why he can be thrown to the wolves, basically, because he's a danger to powerful people.
Yes, well, unfortunately, because the American Justice Department and the very powerful deep state forces in Washington have defined Assange as a danger and defined him as a person somehow connected to the archenemy Russia, they feel constrained by that. Considerations of his human rights don't seem to be prevailing, although there are plenty of examples of Australians in trouble overseas where human rights considerations have prevailed. I'm thinking of Peter Gresti, the Australian journalist who was wrongfully imprisoned in Egypt for several years. I'm also thinking of James Ricketson, the Australian journalist detained wrongfully by the Cambodian government. Our government fought for those people's freedom and return to Australia, and there's no reason why, and a lot of Australians believe this, there's no reason why the Australian government shouldn't be fighting for Assange's return from his 8 years of temporary and increasingly dangerous asylum in the Ecuador embassy in London.
You know, WikiLeaks has revealed files on many, many governments around the world, revealing corruption, crimes, whatnot. They also have revealed files about the Australian government. But you seem to think that it's more the relationship with the U.S., not wanting to get on the wrong side of Washington. That's really behind the inaction of the Australian government. Is that right?
That's right. I don't think that Assange has in any way directly embarrassed the Australian government. I can't think of any major case, although I don't know whether WikiLeaks had anything to do with recent problems over East Timor. I don't think so, but I could be wrong on that.
Why is the relationship with the U.S. so important to the Australian government when there is real no threats to Australia in your region? China is not threatening Australia. What do they need the United States so much for, that they would let one of their own citizens hang out there like that?
The Australian government has conditioned itself, and I'm afraid the opposition has too, to think that we are a very strategically vulnerable country and that China is potentially a threat, as is unbelievably Russia on the other side of the world, and that we need to cling closely to nurse for fear of something worse. It's a very childish, dependent sort of relationship, and speaking as a former Australian ambassador, I'm ashamed of it. We should be standing up for ourselves and making our own foreign policy choices.
Sounds like a classic case of politicians creating a false threat, and then they are the ones that will protect the Australian people. And of course, we need the United States to do that. Now, in America, leaders have been doing this for a long time. Even during the first Cold War, they exaggerated the Soviet threat for a number of reasons. That's well documented now, and it's happening now in the second Cold War. And we also see in the first Cold War there was a McCarthyism where free speech or anybody who opposed American interests or American policy was branded as pro-Russia. And we're seeing it again today. If you don't buy the story, if you simply want détente with the United States without having to love anything about Russia, but simply not wanting tensions between the two nuclear superpowers, you're being smeared again as a Russia lover. It's the same thing happening again as we saw before. But I think, again, we're seeing, it sounds like what you're saying is Australian leaders are telling their people, look, we really need the U.S. to protect us. We've got to be involved with them. And are the Australian people buying that? And how do they buy that? And what role does the media play in that?
Right, that's a good question. Like America, we have a thing called Inside the Beltway. We don't call it that, but we have the same thing. We have a political, journalistic elite around our capital city where I live, Canberra, which comes to common judgments on these sorts of things. The Australian people, once you get outside that elite, still have a sense of decency, still have a sense of fair play, and will not buy this shit, excuse my language on air. But unfortunately, inside the Canberra Beltway, there is this realpolitik, so-called realistic wisdom. Actually, it's completely unrealistic that, look, whatever Assange has or has not done, he's expendable, and we have to stay on the right side of Washington. And in Washington at the moment, there's obviously a very strong anti-Trump, anti-Russia, anti-China drive, and we have to go with the flow of that.
You know, here in the U.S., even the New York Times understands the danger of Assange being prosecuted. They may not like him, and their number 2 legal counsel said this in a speech to some judges on the west coast of the U.S. a couple of months ago, that we don't like Assange, but we don't want him to be prosecuted because they can come after us, especially this particular administration in Washington now, because we do the same thing Assange has done, which is publish classified information. So if they get him, they can get us. But they don't come out in the editorial pages in defense of Assange either. But we know that from that speech. How does the media, at least the non-Murdoch media in Australia, understand that if Assange is prosecuted for publishing true information, that they could be in trouble at some point down the road?
There's no sign of it. I'm working very hard through alternative social media to try and get people to think of those highly relevant comparisons, to think of Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers. Under the current logic, Ellsberg should still be in jail. To think of Woodward and Bernstein and the Watergate break-ins. Woodward and Bernstein should be in jail. We had an Australian called David Hicks. Now, his case has almost no comparison to Assange's, but the one important comparison is that Hicks was several years in Guantanamo as a suspected Taliban supporter. The Australian government under John Howard did not lift a finger to protect him or to bring him home. Strangely enough, it was left in the end to an American military lawyer, Michael Morey, a hero, I think, to fight for Hicks under American law in American courts and to succeed in him being released and brought home, much to the chagrin and embarrassment of the Australian government, which had done absolutely nothing for David Hicks. So I want people in Australia to be aware of that historical comparison. It's highly relevant.
You think something like that could happen in Assange's case, where someone could step forward? Because right now, if he steps out of the embassy, he'll be arrested and most likely extradited. I don't think there's any chance that he won't be. And he'll probably never see the light of day again. What possible relief could there be? What way out is there? Do you see one for Assange right now?
There is a way out that I can see, which requires a certain exercise of courage and decency on the part of an Australian government, whether this one or the next one, which is, I hope, coming very soon. And that is for the Australian government to, first of all, make aggressive representations in London to have Assange's jumping bail charge set aside, because the Swedish government has withdrawn all prosecution. So it wouldn't be beyond the capacity of the Australian High Commission in London, our embassy there, to prevail upon the British government to waive that or set it aside. The next step would be, and I don't want to sound like a John le Carré novel, but things happen, would be for the Australian High Commissioner to drive in his car to the Ecuador embassy to pick up Assange, to drive him under the High Commissioner's protection, possibly with a British police escort, straight to Heathrow Airport onto the tarmac, onto a waiting Australian Qantas plane, because we actually have a direct Qantas flight, the Australian National Airline, from London to Perth without stops. And once Assange is on that plane, there is no way he could be touched by the Americans until he gets to Perth. It would then become an issue for the Australian government and the American government what to do with Assange. But I believe that no Australian government would dare to extradite Assange to the United States without a proper legal process, without a proper charge tested in an Australian court.
But do you think that could really happen legally, that once he steps out of the embassy, he's on British territory? I don't think the Australian government has legal rights over even an Australian citizen in another country's sovereign territory. Is that right?
Well, if the Australian ambassador, High Commissioner, walked into the Ecuador embassy and walked out hand in hand with Assange and put him straight into an embassy car, I cannot see Assange being arrested. If the Australian government had taken the legal steps beforehand of clearing it with the British government to say, look, this is ridiculous, we're going to take him home.
I don't think they'd be able to clear it with the British government very easily, would they? I mean, the power relationship is certainly the other way around. Britain has traditionally more power over Australia.
I would question
and they're in
that.
Britain. And they're in Britain.
I would question that. The British government is on the ropes, and they're very weak at the moment. And I think a firm and assertive defence of Australia's citizens' consular rights, as in the case of other countries, Cambodia and Egypt, would actually work if the Australian government had the gumption to push this to the point where it needs to be pushed.
Oh, I'd love to see them try it. I don't know if the British police would give them an escort. They might set up a roadblock. That's me.
Well, I'm pushing this proposal seriously, because what else have we got? I mean...
Oh, it's brilliant. I haven't heard that one before, actually. I've heard a lot of silly ideas, but that one's not silly, yeah.
The alternative is just to wait for Assange to starve, to freeze to death, or to give up. Whatever the alternatives are, they're very bad, so this is an argument for trying something.
I think I may have left out something in the Australian-U.S. relationship that could be important, and you'd know more about this. What kind of aid comes from the U.S. to Australia, particularly the military and the intelligence services?
Well, the intelligence aid is something of a poisoned chalice, because it is exposed 24/7 to American disinformation and propaganda about the world, and naturally it influences our strategic community in negative ways. We've lost our independence of strategic assessment, I believe. We don't have any aid from America. They don't do us any favours. In fact, we do them a few favours. We host a very important electronic listening post and control post in Central Australia near Alice Springs at a place called Pine Gap, which is a top nuclear target in the event of a nuclear exchange between America and either Russia or China. Pine Gap is used for targeting, for satellite, for surveillance, for everything, and it would be a top-ranked target. So we also have an American visiting base. It's a constantly rotating presence of the US Marines in Darwin in Northern Australia. So we host American bases in Australia. I don't think we owe the Americans anything, really, except our imaginary security guarantee. We have this fond belief that if we are attacked by anybody, they will come to our assistance. There is no guarantee of that whatsoever.
Well, that's what I was just thinking. What does Australia get out of this? Even in the Five Eyes arrangement, you're pretty much obliged to give stuff to them, but they're not necessarily going to give you things that the Australian security services might need. correct?
Well, they give us mountains of stuff, but it's all the American view of the world, which is a very suspect view at the moment.
Ultimately, it comes down to a question of Australia asserting its sovereignty as an independent nation against anyone, including the United States. And they would have to do that to defy America, who wants Assange more than anyone, especially the CIA after Vault 7. So they are doing the bidding of the U.S. and not getting much in return, just to sum up what we've been saying here. Is that right?
You've hit the nail on the head. Australia needs to reassert its belief, which we had in 1949 when we helped negotiate the UN Charter and the UN Security Council rules. We need to reaffirm our belief in multipolarity, in a concert of independent and sovereign nations who come together in the cause of international security. We have to get away from this idea of us and them, that we are the good guys and Russia and China are the bad guys. There are no good guys, there are no bad guys. There's simply a multipolar world in which Australia as a middle power has to navigate its way. I'm not saying we should be anti-American, of course not, or anti-British, but we need to rediscover our independence of outlook. And if Assange came home to Australia, obviously he's not going to be doing WikiLeaks stuff from Australia, but he would be a very important voice in Australia's public foreign policy debate, and I would welcome that voice.
Well, I've been talking to Ambassador Tony Kevin from Canberra, Australia, and I really thank you so much for giving us just a few minutes to take part in the vigil for Julian Assange. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe.
All the best. Bye-bye.
That was Tony Kevin, a former Australian ambassador to Poland and Colombia, speaking to me a couple of weeks ago. We re-aired it today because we found it quite interesting. And joining us now to discuss that and other issues related to Julian Assange and WikiLeaks are Dr. Arthur Chesterfield Evans, a former member of the Australian Parliament for 9 years, medical doctor, and also Tewodros Fikre. Is that correct pronunciation?
Yeah, Tewodros Fikre.
Tewodros Fikre, who is the founder and editor of the Gion Journal. Is that also correct? Gion. Okay. Gion Journal. So let me go with you first, Tewodros, since you need to hit the road. I wanted to, since you've not been with us before, and I really welcome you that we have a new face here on this vigil, which we hold every Friday evening. What is it about WikiLeaks and Julian Assange that that's most important to you, and why do you think it's important for you to take part?
So the very reason that my family came to America and left Ethiopia was because of government tyranny. And, in Ethiopia in 1974, the communists or the Dore government took over and unleashed hell on Ethiopians. And so I know very well, it's an intimate thing. That's something I know intimately in terms of what it's like to be repressed by a government. And so we came to America because it was a land of freedom. And I'm thankful to America for that. But at the same token, none of us could sit down and remain silent just because we have a modicum of freedom and see other people, people far away or people that might not necessarily be right next to us, feeling the heat of oppression, the same oppression that induced me to leave Ethiopia and come here to America to begin with. We should all speak up because as is done to somebody else, we open up the pathway to be done to us. So that's why I speak up. And also as a fellow journalist and somebody that's involved in the media, free press is something that I care about deeply, as most all of us do. And even up until recently in Ethiopia, and throughout a lot of countries within Africa, journalists were targeted viciously and continue to be targeted viciously throughout most of the world. And so for a land that pretends to care or gives lip service to targeted free press, to do this to somebody just because he was doing his job and exposing the malfeasance and corruption of people in power, and effectively lock him up against his will for all this time, it's unconscionable. So we have to speak up, and that's why I'm speaking up.
And tell me a little bit about the publication you started and what is its purpose?
Sure. So the Guion Journal was started 2 years ago after going through a moment of, a stretch of tribulation. I kind of saw how people at the bottom of society, the invisible faces that that get put to the side, and I realized that it's not about the various constructs that divide humanity. It's really the powerful versus the powerless. And so the Guion Journal was started for a lot of reasons, but one of it is to kind of speak against the divisions that induces tribalism, that keeps us at each other. And the other part of it is to kind of speak up against power and try to seek truth. Not necessarily, thinking that we have ownership of it. Nobody knows really what the truth, the objective truth is. But at least we try to seek it, and part of that is to speak against the media narratives that are being spun up on purpose to incite emotions and to antagonize us. And so we try to do the opposite. We don't speak into the divides. We try to bridge people and have rational conversations instead.
I think you may have touched on what my next question is going to be about. Why do you think that the American public and average people around the world are not demanding that Assange be allowed to do his work and be free? Because they are the ones who benefit from it, clearly, when the rulers are the ones who are hurt by it, which is why we're in the situation we're in with him. Mm-hmm. Why do you think there is not more consciousness about this, and why this is not an issue for people?
I think we've been conditioned over successive decades and generations of, which has reached a fever pitch now, of just accepting. So when it's one outrage after the other, you kind of get inured to it, and you don't really pay attention to what's going on anymore. So, led by a chorus of mainstream propagandists, they've kind of successfully programmed us to look at injustice as a hashtag and not necessarily as something that we should all care about. And so, something comes up, we get outraged, 24 hours passes, a news cycle passes, and then we forget about it. And this is we've reached a derangement level with the Trump administration now, because everything is an outrage. What he says is an outrage. This afternoon, Whitaker was on, giving his testimony, and the whole bread and circus of it all. And
he's the Attorney General elect, right? He's the Attorney General nominee.
Correct. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Correct. And so, this is why, by the way, what Julian Assange did was such a threat, because instead of partaking in that carnival, he was actually doing the job of a journalist, which is exposing corruption and malfeasance. This is what journalism is supposed to be about. It's not recording what somebody else says and just pass it along. It's not echoing the authorities in government. It's to question them. That's why the founders of America, and the rights of free speech were enshrined in the Constitution, because some of the founders, anyways, realized that the only thing that the last line of defense between freedom and tyranny is a truly free press. And so that's why it's in the Constitution. That's why journalists have such esteem within the broader public. And unfortunately, mainstream media, the model of monetizing outrage and monetizing sensationalism, we've actually devolved in ways that the young journalism of the of William Randolph Hearst pales into comparison compared to what MSNBC, CNN, and Fox News and their kind are doing. And so here comes along Julian Assange doing the job of a muck ranker, and he's catching the brunt of it. And it's that's the outrage. But again, we're so focused on the outrage of politicians pretending like they're fighting each other that we're looking past the things that we should really be paying attention to.
And you just brought up what I was going to mention, which is this phony partisanship. Right. You wrote a piece you allowed us to republish an excellent article you wrote that we republished in Consortium News on Malcolm, what Malcolm X said back in the 60s, that rings so true today about African American political leaders, in particular someone like Kamala Harris and also Barack Obama, as you pointed out. And in those days when when Obama was in power, and WikiLeaks revealed crimes of the Bush administration, or when Bush was in power, that was heralded by a Democrat or liberal press. Now that he's revealed some of the shortcomings, to put it mildly, of Hillary Clinton, they hate his guts and they want him out. So talk to me a little bit about the role of partisanship. How phony is it and how real is it? Because it is quite heightened right now in Washington, I could tell you that.
So it's phony within the establishment. They all know it's a game. I've been to, if you're ever in D.C., there's a bar or a restaurant. I can never go there now, but there's a restaurant called Old Devil's Grill, and this is where it's like the watering hole of the political establishment. And the news reporters go there, and a lot of Congress people go there as well. I mean, you'll see them. I remember the first time I actually saw this, it shocked me. I didn't realize exactly what I saw until later on when I was looking back in reflection. But I saw like there was a crossfire on CNN, and there was two Congress people. I want to say one of them was Barney Frank and somebody else, but I can't really recall exactly who it was. And it was left versus right. They were just yelling at each other, like frothing at their mouth, and just you would have thought they were about to get up and punch each other. So later on that evening, I went to, I was in D.C., so I stopped by after finishing up school and stopped by Old Devil's Grill. I was like, let me see what this is about. So I walk inside there, and there they are, right there. The same people I saw on CNN, almost declaring a holy war on each other, like hanging out and laughing together. And so I didn't realize it at that time, but I see it now for what it is. It's a joke to them. It's a reality show that it's like during the Roman Empire, they had bread and circus to keep the public distracted, and so that's what we have. But it's a deadly serious thing for the rest of society because we believe it, and we keep inhaling this toxic partisanship, and as a consequence of it, society gets fractured and ghettoized, and we fight each other while the powers that be are enjoying the fruits of our labor while we are left with nothing but seeds. And so this is in a lot of ways, this is what Julian Assange was exposing. Not just with what happened with the DNC server, but there was a lot of the Cablegate and a lot of other things that he exposed, where he was showing the dog and pony show of not just American politics, but even a geopolitical level. And that is why he's a threat to the establishment, and why we should defend him, because he's in a lot of ways what he's doing is vital to not national security but humanity security, because the reason why these wars keep getting started, the reason why economic inequalities are destroying the lives of millions, if not billions, around the world, is because of policies that nefarious and malicious policies, and that's what he was doing, and WikiLeaks is doing, and that's why they're hated, because the establishment press, the corporate press, is under the same dole as the politicians. They all work, and they're all under the fingers of, or the thumbs of corporations and the oligarchy. And so it's up to us to rally behind it, because as he's silenced, then other folks that are trying to do the same that are trying to do the same thing. In a lot of ways, the Guillaume Journal is following the same model as the WikiLeaks, not in terms of what exposing the things that they're doing, because we don't have that capacity, but in terms of being funded by readers and the audience, being disavowing corporate contributions. This is the model that I really believe could work. And when you do that, you take away the power of the patrons of corporate media. So that's why corporate media is upset, and that's why corporate politicians are upset. And so it's up to us, the people, because the true enemy of the ones that feel the heat the most from all these corporate friendly politicians and corporate friendly pundits and mainstream journalists are us. We get distracted, and then we eventually get the short end of the stick. So it's important that we pay attention because ultimately we're going to pay the price for it.
Well, thank you, Theodoros. That's excellent. I know you have to get going. You may rejoin us later. I happen to be a block and a half away from the old Ebbett Grill, by the way. I'm at the National Press Club in Washington. I've been there many times. So if you're ever down in D.C. again, let's meet up there, and we may see something interesting. But hopefully we'll see you later in the broadcast. Thank you again very much. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.
So I want to move on to Dr. Arthur Chesterfield Evans, who again served in the Australian Parliament. And I wanted to first ask you a little bit about yourself and your interest in WikiLeaks and why you're defending Julian Assange, which not many, even former politicians do, let alone current ones. I mean, what is it about WikiLeaks? Yeah.
I was a state senator, more what you would say in the US, not in the
provincial parliament. I see.
Yeah. So in a sense, I'm analogous to the guy who's put this motion up, who is in a canton in Switzerland. Switzerland's cantons are the equivalent of states, basically. Right. So I've taken an interest in power relationships. I was in a small party that was on the crossbench, so I observed the big guys doing stuff and tried to do negotiations to get things which I saw as being progressive, but stopped by the fact that the big parties were monetarized and acting in the interests of vested interests, basically. So I got interested in power, and then I got interested in, of course, what the Swiss have done and are doing with their citizen-initiated referenda. And that's, I guess, how I ended up looking a bit at Switzerland, what it did. And this is feeding into this, because this has come out of one of their small parliaments, more or less. And the question is, can it go beyond that? Particularly helped with the possibility of citizens-initiated referenda to force their federal government to make it foreign policy, which if that were the case, it could escalate from being started off in a state canton parliament, then taken up by the public in significant numbers, and they can do a citizens-initiated referenda, as we'd call them and that's what they call it in Australia anyway. That would then, it becomes binding. If it passes at a national referendum, it becomes binding on the federal government. So it's the idea that an individual, well, obviously a group of individuals who get signatures together, can actually escalate their power right up to telling the federal government what to do. And that doesn't exist that I know of in any other jurisdiction in the world. If I'm wrong, well, enlighten me,
It's interesting. I hope that we're joined by former U.S. Senator Mike Gravel, who's been twice a guest on it, because after he left the U.S. Senate, his main life's work has been what he calls the national initiative. Because in the U.S., we have 26 states that have this type of citizens-initiated laws, and not on a federal level, however. That's interesting that you're saying that could happen in Australia, that a referendum can be binding on the federal government of Australia?
No, in Australia we had a referendum on gay marriage, equal marriage equality, but that was initiated by the federal government basically because they didn't have the guts to bring it through against their own conservatives. So
it was a referendum, not an initiative. No, that's the difference.
It wasn't citizens initiated. Right. No.
So it's Switzerland's system is direct democracy, a form of it anyway, and that's what.
Well, it's the most direct there is. That's what I think has given great hope. If it could become Swiss foreign policy, I'm not sure. I'm still not sure how Assange would get himself from the Ecuadorian embassy through England on the airport to Switzerland. But certainly, if you had a country saying we'll take him, and he's not actually got an indictable offence. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but there's at least a possibility there.
That would be very significant. I don't think there's any doubt about it. Whether it had a practical application or not, to have a government, a Swiss government, a European government saying that they would take him and that he should be free would be something the British government and the Americans would not look very kindly on. And you'd have to think, even if that initiative won and that was binding on the federal government of Switzerland, how much effort they'd put into it. As I read in that piece, the federal parliament did not look kindly on Assange. in one of its statements.
Well, it's about the power of individuals versus the power of governments, isn't it?
That's right. That's what we're talking about here tonight, pretty much. That's the overarching theme. So tell me, when did you start speaking out for WikiLeaks and Julian Assange?
Well, I guess I hadn't got a very loud voice anymore, being just a citizen. So, I mean, I've always thought, well, you know, I mean, what the WikiLeaks came up with was so significant, and the point was that if that there's a whistleblower who actually gets the brown envelope or the data upload, whatever the currency is, you know, and then that's got to be amplified and distributed, and that's where WikiLeaks is a very important link in the chain of journalism. I mean, once it's out there, other people can carry it, whereas they may have been reluctant before. And if they are reluctant, then that means all journalists are reluctant. So, I mean, having seen a lot of bad things happen where mates got together and made a deal, and usually behind closed doors. In Australia, we have huge amounts of property development drives the economy to a large extent, far more than it really should. And that always relies on rezonings and various relationships between politicians and money. And that it's really, I mean, I think it's much less subtle once it's real estate development has such huge profits, you see, and there's only a certain set amount of land. So this idea that, you know, you go and see a politician and you give them a bag of money, which helps them win the election, and then you get whatever you wanted from them. It's corruption beyond the level. Like, I mean, I can talk about corruption in Australia. It used to be, you know, a building company would build a weekend holiday house down the coast for a politician, and they would give them a contract. And if they got caught, you know, there'd be a big scandal. Now they give a political party a large donation, and they get given more or less whatever they want. They can get, you know, well, you want to build a railway here, you want to build a road there, you want to have this state asset, you can have it. So the corruption is, it's like the government has been bought, lock, stock, and policy, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah, well, it sounds like another country that I know of. I want to welcome U.S. Senator Mike Gravel from Alaska. He served in the 1970s. And Mike, I don't know if you heard our discussion earlier, but we were talking about your favorite topic, which is citizens' initiatives in Switzerland. I think you have to unmute your mic, please. Or please have his mic unmuted. Okay, there we go, Mike. Welcome. Did you hear us talking about that?
Yeah.
Citizens' initiatives? You did.
This is Arthur Chesterfield, right?
That's correct.
Okay. Yes. Well, let me point out that no government is going to support empowering the people to make laws. Now, let me give one caveat. I hope that we can get Julian Assange out of jail, the Peruvian jail, by not waiting for the initiative or the process of the people to make laws to become enacted, because that will take too long. In fact, I'm dubious whether I will see it in my lifetime. But speaking to what Arthur was talking about, in Switzerland, where the initiative has been copied in several places around the world, particularly the United States, where we use the Swiss model. The Swiss model is not a very good model in point of fact, because it still keeps representative government. And keep in mind, representative government is the device that the elites, the 1%, control society. And so when you have, like we have it in California, we have an initiative, but it's been corrupted such that it's really the wealthy person's initiative, not the ordinary citizen's initiative. And so what I've done is I've put together an amendment to the American Constitution. And now what I've done can be applied in any country in the world, particularly Australia. Now, since there's only two venues for change, one is the people, and the other, of course, is the government where the problem exists. So what you have to do is to be able to amend the Constitution so that the people have a legislature of the people where they can pass laws individually vote for legislation individually. And you would ask, well, how can we amend the Constitution? In our Constitution, there's no provision, and this was purposely done to protect slavery. In our Constitution, there's no provision for the people to be able to make changes. The changes, the Article 5 is a process whereby the government can change, but there's no procedures out there for the people to do it. But the people can do it, just that simple. The people can assemble, which is a right under the First Amendment, can assemble to have an election, not conducted by the government, conducted by an organization of people. And when enough people vote for this, it becomes the law of the land. What's the standard for the voting? Well, we only have one standard in our country, and that is the presidential election every 4 years. And so what we're saying is when the majority of the people who voted in the most recent election vote to enact and empower themselves with a legislature of the people, it becomes the law of the land. That could be done in Australia, since you're reputed to be a democracy. I view all democracies as just plain representative government. There's no democracy that exists in the world. The closest thing to it is, of course, the Swiss. But if we were to be able to succeed, I tried to work on it in South Korea, but it could work in New Zealand. It'd be obvious that if people understood, I'm in a process of writing a book. The title of it is Governance, the Failure of Representative Government and a Solution. I go into great detail as to how this can be done and be legally. It both is an amendment and a Legislative Procedures Act, because what's important about, and we don't have that in any initiative that I know of in the world. What's important is that making laws is very serious and should be done with great deliberation. And so that takes a lot of details. There's no place that I know where you have great deliberation on what you call referenda. I define referenda as what the government wants you to vote on. I define initiative as what the people want to initiate and vote upon. Those are the distinctions. So Arthur, I was impressed with your commitment to it. Let me give you my email, because when I finish my book, I'd like to send it to you probably this summer. And that is
Mike, if you tell it now, everyone is going to hear it. So thousands of people. Just want to let you know. If you want to give out your email to thousands of people, go right ahead.
I don't mind. I got enough traffic.
Thanks, I appreciate it.
mg@mikegravel.us. You got that?
Repeat that? No, repeat it again.
And well, with all these billions of people, you want to make sure.
Well, now you've stuck your foot in it. I want to keep it there. Okay, MG.
In the interest of full disclosure, Joe and I are very good friends.
That's why I was warning you, Mike.
mg@mikegravel, one word, .us.
Well, you know, Mike, the reason why this subject came up is because I don't know if you heard this part at the very beginning. I read that the Parliament of the City of Geneva, what we would call a city council in the U.S., but the Geneva Parliament voted to invite the government of Switzerland to bring Assange to Switzerland to
Wonderful.
Give him asylum. So Arthur brought up the possibility of this becoming an initiative, maybe to put pressure to make it binding on the federal government of Switzerland to actually try to do that.
First off, you got to get some leadership in Switzerland to do this. And if anybody's got contacts who can hear my voice, please step forward in Switzerland, organize yourself, and you could initiate this very directly. And I'm sure it would pass in Switzerland, because they have a great sense of fair play. And I'll tell you, it wouldn't be too shabby for Assange to live in Switzerland. That's pretty good. That's where a lot of wealthy people go to spend their substance.
Well, they can step forward now because they have your email address. So hopefully, anyone listening in Switzerland.
Well, they don't have to contact me. They can just go do it. But it's got to be somebody in Switzerland. It's got to be somebody in Switzerland. And the city council is already of Geneva, which is very substantial. If they've already passed this resolution, I think that the city council itself could initiate an initiative in this regard and get a vote in short order.
Well, that's interesting. That could be the next step.
Yeah, Joe, I just want to really underscore one thing. What you've been doing is a drumbeat to save Julian Assange, and this drumbeat, I know your intent, without talking to you, is to continue this effort until he is a free man. And so I'm glad you've picked up the cudgel to bring this about, and all it does is increase my friendship and admiration for you.
Well, Mike, that's very kind of you.
That's my commercial for the program.
That's why I brought you on, because I wanted to hear you say that. So thank you. I think I should give kudos to the people at Unity for J who started this, particularly Susie Dawson. I have just picked up the hosting of it a couple of weeks ago, but we turned it into a weekly vigil, and it's a bit of work to do this every week, simply because of what we were talking about earlier, that there's a news cycle that changes every 24, 48 hours, and what was really important suddenly becomes forgotten. And I was suggesting that The Guardian and BuzzFeed could hide behind erroneous stories about Assange and the Russiagate saga, because they know in a couple of days people are going to be talking about something else. So we are every Friday talking about this issue, and we are not subject to that cycle.
And this is the only thing that I know within the news process, because you're quite right. They publish an article, they think they've done their duty, and that's it. They don't want to go back to that because they've already done that. But to be able to, what is it? It takes nine spots to sell a product. Well, your drumbeat is going to be certainly more than 9 spots. But what it's going to do, it will sink in with the media. And so I would hope that those within the sound of your voice will spread the word about this drumbeat of freedom that you've initiated worldwide. And
I'm laughing because you say within the sound of my voice, and I am inside the National Press Building here in Washington, D.C., surrounded by corporate reporters. Although I'm in a quiet room here, I'm actually in a studio. In this studio was where the first C-SPAN call-in program was ever broadcast. It's a very small room, but it was back, I think, in the 70s, early 80s, where C-SPAN first did their call-in show. So there's a little studio here, and there are a couple people trying to come in, but they see that I'm still using it. So I hope they can hear us.
How did you happen to? I thought you were broadcasting from your office. I didn't know you went into the press club.
I have been, but from this day, I am doing it from Press Club. I decided to try it from here because I found out about this studio, and I've recently become a member of the club, so I have access to it. And I'm here talking to you from Washington, where Mike used to live when he was in the Senate, and then afterward running for president. So it's really great to see you again, Mike, on here and to stick up for Gravel, because we have 2 foreign politicians here on the air right now.
Arthur and me.
Yeah. And we had just a moment ago an interview with a former Australian ambassador to Colombia and Poland, and he's a strong supporter of Assange.
I know. I heard it, Joe. I came in last week. No, last week I think I had a dental emergency, but I came in before that, and I didn't realize that I can't get on until you let me on. So
I'm not the gatekeeper here. I don't know. You can join anytime you want. We can send you the link every week to get on. But what I forgot what I wanted to ask you here. We were saying that
Joe, I'm entitled to have these senior moments. You're not.
I know, but I'm getting there, Mike. I am catching up to you. So
everybody's catching up to me.
What I wanted to you're standing still. I'm catching up. No, it's Tony Kevin, the ambassador, made an interesting proposal. I wanted to ask you and Arthur about this. He suggested, as a former ambassador who understands how diplomacy works, that the Australian High Commissioner in London, the Australia's ambassador to the UK, actually get in his official limousine drive to the Ecuadorian embassy.
Oh yeah, I agree.
Walk in there.
I agree with that. I agree with that.
Walk him out, and they could arrest him, but it would be a big incident if they grabbed him out of the arms of the Australian ambassador. But they
but the High Commissioner should assert himself and physically stop them from touching Assange. I mean, if you had a High Commissioner, if somebody's really courageous, who really will just intimidate the police, and the people that would arrest him at that level, they're not all that swift. You know, we're not talking about the head of the Justice Department, but if the High Commissioner would crank himself up and say that this is a matter of Australian sovereignty being asserted here, and then bring a couple of big strong guys from the embassy so that they can throw themselves in front of whoever wants to arrest Assange. Then they leap into the car and they rush off to the airport. What the hell? I always had a vision that the way to get Assange out was to have a helicopter hover over the embassy, and Assange comes out to his balcony and grabs onto the helicopter, and the helicopter takes him straight away to the airport. But we would need an angel to be able to fund the helicopter and the private jet. But I think it should be. I mean, you have no choice but to confront aggressively the oppression of government, and you can effectively do it. I went through this whole process with the Pentagon Papers, and I'll tell you, if you confront it, you'll be surprised. Sometimes you win.
Well, that's right. And if you don't try, you certainly won't win. But I don't think that the High Commissioner to the UK is such a man who would do that. But that is a pretty interesting plan that he had. But I suggested that the police would not give an escort. They may put a roadblock there. They may try to stop the car. But we would hope
that the helicopter. The helicopter.
Yeah. Arthur, what did you think of that idea of Tony Kevins?
Well, it's a good enough idea. It's an ideal idea. That's what the Australian government should do. But George Brandis was a very conservative Attorney General before he was appointed Australian High Commissioner in London. He actually got quite a lot of criticism just before he left for appointing a large number of people who were felt to be very conservative and not very appropriate to judicial appointments. And then he swanned off. His nickname was Bookshelves because he had spent a lot of money on bookshelves in his office, very expensive bookshelves. And the point was that Attorney General in our times, putting in huge numbers of bookshelves in the digital age, did sort of have a little message there about where his head was. And then he went off to be High Commissioner in London, which from an Australian point of view is kind of back to the alma mater, colonial days, lovely posting, cultural events, blah, blah. He was very active in supporting his fairly conservative view of culture as well. So he's a deeply conservative man. So all I'd say is we haven't really got the right ambassador for that plan.
Yeah, that's what I was afraid of.
Arthur, I would still approach him for the very simple reason that when you talk about a conservative person, we have a bias because they're crazy. But a deep, serious conservative person is concerned about the level of freedom in society. And what Assange represents is a gatekeeper on the level of freedom that we need to enjoy, whether you're liberal or conservative. So I think that that the ambassador's position, all he can do is say no. So I think he ought to be approached by maybe a group of citizens, yourself and several others, and just write him a letter and maybe get 10, 20 people to sign the letter and send it to him and see what his response is. You never know. I've found through life, if you don't ask, you don't get. And so if you ask, you got a chance of getting and you got a chance of not getting. So it improves the situation very quickly when you ask.
I would extend that. Go ahead, Arthur, please.
Well, you could be right. I mean, I've been too conservative as a progressive, you might say, and not acknowledged there is a paradox in a lot of conservatives where they're highly conservative in their politics, but this individualism sometimes leads to support for things like this. And I guess the guy in Switzerland who put the motion up is from the People's Party, which is which has been said to be, I mean, I didn't know, said to be a fairly conservative party, and yet he's put this through. So, I mean, yeah, as you're right, it's probably worth asking. And even if you get told no, you've at least gone through the motions and perhaps got some publicity for saying so.
Correct, Arthur. So I hope you'll take the initiative in that regard, Arthur.
Yeah, I can do that for you.
It's just a communication, and when you sign it with your former title. I use my title a lot because, at least in restaurants, so I can get a decent table. But
it's funny you should say that, because I could have kept the title for life, the Honourable, in front of my name, and I didn't request that because it seemed a little pompous.
Well, I'll tell you what, when you've rendered public service, it's not pompous, it's just accuracy. So don't be shy.
Well, not all the people there were especially honourable, and so it.
How well I know that in politics. Don't look for too much honour in representation.
Yeah. Is it too late for you to go back and ask now for that?
I don't know. I hadn't thought about it, I confess.
Well, maybe we ought to.
It's worth it. Letter.
Just for the purpose of that letter, yes. Then you can ditch it again. Then you can ditch it again after that.
See what he says. See what he says. You never know, because here he's got to have a degree of patriotism, and when an Australian, you got a relationship with Great Britain, but damn it all, Great Britain hasn't always been a great favor to you. And so I would hope that he would realize that there should be some independence from Great Britain, and that Great Britain is oppressing one of his citizens. And so, I'd write the letter in that tone, that respectful, always got to be respectful, and write a letter in the tone that asks him to protect the individual rights of an Australian citizen, regardless if it's against Great Britain or Russia or China. Makes no, never mind. The sovereignty question is very vital from your point of view and our point of view.
And you,
Arthur.
Would you suggest then that I'd say, well, look, if he gets offered asylum by a third country, and that possibility has been raised, would the Australian government do the escort as Tony Kevin suggested? And would he be involved? Would he be involved in that courier job, if you want to call it that, from the Ecuadorian embassy to Heathrow?
Well, if the High Commissioner acknowledges in some way that he has a responsibility for the well-being of an Australian citizen, I would not hit him with taking Assange to Heathrow. I would just hit him with the general fact that what can he do to ameliorate the situation of an Australian citizen trapped in a phony, I might say, a phony or a set up charge initiated by the United States. Now, I know a lot of Australians just hunker down to support the United States, but be that as it may, just see if you can get a commitment from him that
well,
he has.
It's certainly a good thing to ask him. The Australian relationship with the US is very subservient because they're seen as bailing us out of Japanese invasion in the Second World War. That's kind of very much in our consciousness, and I think that's why we are so much their lapdogs, really, and we really have to get over it, But
well, the problem there is that you're quite right. The Australians are so subservient to the United States, and you're not the only country that sucks up to us because of the way we wield power throughout the world. But I think that my take is that Australians are a lot like Alaskans. They're very independent people. They've carved out a society from the wilderness. The thing is to call upon that independence to say, hey, we're with the United States when they're right, but when they're wrong, like invading Iraq, we're not with the United States. And it's like if you don't tell the truth to a friend, he's not really a friend of yours. So you can always take the criteria that if you have bad breath and somebody tells you you have bad breath, you say, well, goddamn, he's a friend, and I'm going to correct that problem. So I would take that approach that you're not subservient to the United States. You shouldn't be. You're a sovereign nation. And my God, there's a lot of independent people in Australia. And I would tout that extensively, that you're sovereign and you're prepared to support those who do the right thing. But if they don't do the right thing, you don't want to support them, period. Okay,
I guess what you're giving is a progressive Australian view, which is we have difficulty getting implemented, shall we say?
Okay, but yeah, well, your progressive Australian is about the equivalent of a progressive American, but unfortunately, a lot of progressives are liberal invasionists or want to interfere in other countries. We have a young lady who's running for president named Tulsi Gabbard, and she's fantastic. She's articulate, mature, and of course she's what you would call in the old fashioned a peacenik. Yet she has a military background, is a major and did 2 tours in Iraq, and now she's running for president. She's only 38 years old, but she's the most mature elected official I've ever met or ever heard of. I haven't met her. I just have heard her repeatedly. But just book that name, Tulsi Gabbard. She's a Hindu, I want to point out. So to be the first Hindu in the American government.
There's progress for you.
Yeah, well, there's room for everybody.
Exactly.
Great. Well, and Andrew, I've got you'll send me an email so I have how I can get you, because I would like to send you my book as soon as I get it completed this summer. But in fact, Joe, I want to ask you, Joe, would you write a preface when I get the book to you? Maybe you could consider writing a preface for it.
Well, in front of maybe thousands of people now, you put me on the spot. I cannot say no to you. Very clever, Mike.
Well,
very clever.
Yeah. You couldn't say no even if we were just you and I,
I will certainly very happily do that for you, Mike.
Okay, great.
That would be a great thing for me. I would really appreciate
That's after you read it. I mean, don't make the commitment until you read it.
Well, if I'm an editor now, Mike, so maybe you don't want me to read it. Because I'm going to maybe get the pencil out.
So, well, I'm so happy that you have that you're the head of Consortium News, because you're just a gem in the raw. And now that you've got a vehicle to use your imagination and your views, which I know those views very strongly. So who's this Kathy Vogan?
Kathy Vogan. Kathy, why don't you come in and say hello to Senator Mike Gravel?
Hi, Kathy.
Hi, Mike. How are you?
For my age, not bad.
Hang on. Now, that was historical. The last time you came on, it was really, really useful information for the movement. I'm trilingual, in fact, but French and German are my other languages, and I've been really pouring through the Swiss news. And there was one thing that was a little bit disconcerting. I loved the spirit of it, but unfortunately, the whole debate in the municipal council generated by Eric Bertina is around the idea of Julian Assange being a whistleblower, not a journalist, not a publisher, not the editor-in-chief of former editor-in-chief of WikiLeaks. So I would ask the supporters out there, especially those who speak French, please, I have already written to Radio Lac, which is one of the Geneva radio stations, because they were discussing that for about 12 minutes yesterday. And it was a very radical idea to defend whistleblowers. But the problem about whistleblowers is that they are indictable. Journalists are not. We've had it pointed out to us a couple of times, particularly by William Binney, that Executive Order 13526, Section 1.7, and that is Obama's law, makes it illegal to classify material simply to hide a crime or embarrassment to an administration. So it's illegal to classify information that reveals a crime, but it is not illegal to publish it if it is leaked. So what I told Radio Lac in Switzerland is Julian Assange is a journalist, just like you. And I think if the Swiss actually move ahead with this debate on the basis of Julian being a journalist and not a whistleblower, then I think it will possibly go a lot further. Now, they were the people at Radio Lac were absolutely astounded that such a discussion, and they were only supposed to be talking about in the municipal council, we're only supposed to be talking about moving an office from one place to another, but then it ended up as a 1-hour debate about giving Julian Assange, the whistleblower, asylum. And at first they were astounded that you know, about this, the cheek of them. So they're going to ask something like this of our federation. But then they started, there were 3 journalists on the program discussing together, and they started talking about it, and they thought it was a damn good idea to protect whistleblowers. Otherwise, we all sink into sink into totalitarianism. Now, you know, that's a dream far off, but certainly we have to be very, very careful. There are 3, you know, because Julian Assange has been so misreported on, and WikiLeaks have actually issued a list of all of the misreporting, common misconceptions. But if I might make it simple, there are 3 levels. Level 1, the truth. Journalist, former editor-in-chief of WikiLeaks, publisher. That's the truth. Common misconception, and usually quite innocent, whistleblower, and the whistleblowing site. So that's not true, because WikiLeaks is a publisher that receives the information from whistleblowers. Whistleblowers who are the people that you might work with, that see that you're doing something terribly wrong, that try all the avenues to correct that. It doesn't work. Chelsea Manning did this, Edward Snowden did this. And finally, their last resort is to go to the press. Now, the problem is, you know, even with the Pentagon Papers, there was great hesitation, and finally it got published. But most of the time, it doesn't pass the gatekeepers, and so that information doesn't get out. And as Andrew Fowler, one of our best Australian journalists, has pointed out, what governments like is the official leak that they can pass to their favorite journalist, who will get the story out the way they want it, with the spin they like, right? So there is a publishing house, there is a journalist, there is an editor-in-chief, who is now Kristen Hrafnsson, the wonderful Icelandic journalist who's taken the baton from Julian Assange. So there is WikiLeaks that will, if this information is previously unpublished, if it is true and they go through rigorous processes to fact check, and they have never been wrong, they will, and it's in the public interest, they will publish. And then finally, the 3rd level, total smear, hacker. And that is still a great problem in the Australian media. Christine Assange has already spoken about that in her last interview, saying that Australian newspapers, she never stops contacting them about saying that Julian is a hacker. When he did a little bit of hacking as a bright young kid when he was 17, but that was more like what we call penetration testing. And that was just to test the security of systems. They would never do any damage, and they would just leave a message to say, your system is not secure. And of course, we have just found out at DEFCON 29, which is the hacking conference in Las Vegas, that 30 children around the age of 11 were able to hack into the Florida voting, a replica of the Florida voting machine in under 30 minutes. And one of them took less than 10 minutes. So if a child can do it, who's at fault here? Is it really the hacker, or is it the government or any other corporation that is not keeping their systems secure enough? This point has been made by other vigilists that if governments want things to be secret, well, their first responsibility is to build secure systems. But is that a good idea? What WikiLeaks has released is evidence of war crimes, of terrible corruption. You know, Article 16 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights includes the right to receive, not just impart information freely, but to receive it. And I believe that all humanity has that right. And that's the thing that needs to be argued in Switzerland, that Julian Assange is a person that has been giving us that information, that we have the right. We have all the right to know the truth so we can make informed decisions when we vote.
He's a piece of work.
I've been busting to say that because you know, I've got very little sleep very early in the morning.
You're very knowledgeable. You're very knowledgeable, and you express it very intelligently.
Thank you, Mike. I've been a WikiLeaks supporter since 2010. And very avidly and very, very diligently. And, you know, it's been our job to fact check. It's been our job to try and correct. I mean, there's not much you can do about the trolls, but you can correct the people who have good intentions, but they've just gone off on the wrong track.
Very good point you make that, because there's some people that they're not going to change on regardless of what you show them. But there are a lot of sincere people that if you point out the errors that they're hanging on to, they'll correct. So I just want to underscore your concept in that regard.
What the concept? Well, the concept.
Yeah, the concept that you just articulated.
Oh, sorry, I thought you.
That go for the middle. Go for the fine people. Don't go for the garbage. And God knows there's a lot of what I would call the crazies out there on the far left, far right. They're just unrelated to what is truly going on. And so
we have a problem of the centrists too, Mike. We got centrists, extreme.
Oh yeah, well the centrists, they're ignorant.
Centrist extremism exists as well. As Tariq Ali, the British filmmaker and writer, has pointed out in one of his books, that they're clinging on to the status quo. And we're talking about the liberal parties and the two established parties in the US and part of the Labour Party in Britain and whatnot, and probably in Australia as well, want the system to carry on because it's good for them. Same with the editors and journalists of big publications and media, TV stations, good for them, the status quo.
Joe, could I ask you a question?
Yeah.
What came of the idea to get some member of the British Parliament? I think there was one member who was calling for the government to change their approach to Julian and disavow the phony charges with respect to jumping bail. And of course, the Swedish part of that equation has changed and has gone away. And so is there anything come of trying to get members of Parliament? Corbyn would be a natural. If he made one speech on the subject, it would lodge this as a major problem in Britain. So Anything come of that suggestion, Joe?
Well, we've got two campaigns now we're talking about. That was the first one, and I was hoping that Ray McGovern of VIPS, Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, would draft such a memo and send it to Jeremy Corbyn. And I think here that group is dismissed by the establishment, very much so. But I think in the UK, I'm just guessing, that if Corbyn's office sees these lists of people who worked at the National Security Agency, at the Central Intelligence Agency, at the FBI, at very high levels, people with decades and centuries maybe of experience together, when we add you in, Mike, because you were also a member of VIPS, that they might be impressed by that. But it's definitely worth an effort to do that. And the second campaign is the one we've just talked about tonight, of getting a letter to the High Commissioner in London. And that would extend to any Australian citizen listening to try to send letters to the High Commissioner as well, to put some pressure on. If the letters come in, the emails come in, phone calls come in, he may have to feel like he has to respond, even if he's not inclined to do anything to help Julian. At least he knows that people out there are aware of his inaction and calling for him to reverse that.
Joe, might I add, as a response to Mike, Jeremy Corbyn should have the motivation to stand by Julian Assange, because both of them are victims of the coordinated smear of the Integrity Initiative.
Right.
So, well, somebody needs to draft a letter. I thought that Ray McGovern hopefully would do it. So
Ray's in the middle of a move to North Carolina as we're speaking right now. After more than 50 years living in Washington, in the same 8-bedroom house in Arlington, Virginia, he's actually moved to be close to the grandchildren. So he's been out of action. But once he's all set up again, I'm going to press him on that. Plus the other VIPS members. I think that should be done. It's their call. I don't have anything to say about what they do, but I could suggest that they do that.
Yeah, and the letter wouldn't be difficult. It's just a question of addressing him honorably and pointing out the fact that Julian Assange is a journalist, and protecting the rights of journalists is extremely important for a democracy to thrive. So something like that. And then if, I don't have any contacts in London that I could use to hand deliver it. But I think that Ray McGovern, who heads up our organization, would be the person to get the letter off. And he could include all of our names in support of the letter. So
I think that would be an excellent idea. We could ask Dan Ellsberg to sign on as well.
Oh, I'm sure
excuse me. You've got another guest who's dying to say something. I think it's George Samoli.
Bring him in. I don't see him.
Yeah, I didn't see him either, but he's just texting us like crazy. Can we bring him in from the waiting room, please, Joe or Kitty? Somebody thinks that Kitty may have fallen asleep.
This is the problem I have getting in, Joe. It's not as simple as just pressing a button.
Oh, well, please continue, and we'll do our best to get George in as soon as possible.
Yeah, well, we need a new voice.
Yes. Yeah, we're...
Joe, might I do
George,
a plug then?
Come in.
Oh, he's here. Great.
Well, there he is.
And we have Simon. No, we have Simon.
Simon?
Yes, Simon is with us from Australia. And there's George. So George was dying to get in. And you're in, George. So you got the floor. You've been listening to our conversation.
George, go ahead.
Unmute yourself, please. Another problem.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, good. So I was listening particularly when you were talking now about Jeremy Corbyn. And I mean, I've always thought that really the key to Julian's freedom is Jeremy Corbyn, because this is the most likely way that Julian can escape from the prison that he's in at the moment, is if Corbyn becomes prime minister and just says that enough of this nonsense. this farce has gone on long enough. This punishment has gone on long enough, and you just bring it to an end. He'll pack him off on a plane, and that's it. You know, you send him straight to Australia, and it's and Corbyn has
Simon, would you write a letter to Corbyn and
it's
maybe
George
get
we're talking to now. George.
Pardon me?
Well, I think
George,
that can sort of,
you write a letter?
Yes.
Please do.
I'd be happy to. And of course, you must remember that his chief advisor is Seamus Milne, who was an editor at The Guardian, and he's certainly very sympathetic to Julian. So I think that's really the key. The one thing that concerns me is whether Corbyn really would have the political courage were he to become prime minister, just to say enough of this, put him on a plane to Australia, and it's all over. Because you know, the man's being smeared day and night. I mean, it's just as outrageous what goes on in London now. He's smeared. One day he's smeared as an anti-Semite and a Nazi. Next day he's smeared as a card-carrying communist. Another day he's smeared as a kind of a lapdog of Putin's. I mean, this is the entire media is running this campaign. So it would require some real courage and determination on his part to step in and say, you know, because Corbyn knows exactly what's going on. I mean, you know, he's under no illusion. He knows that this is completely bogus. The charges against Julian. It's really a question of whether would he have the political strength to persevere on this course.
Well, I think
at the moment he's leader of the opposition, and you know, Theresa May is not going to listen to anything he says. I mean, the real question is that's after the election, any prime minister.
George, that's not the purpose of the exercise. I wouldn't waste any time with Theresa May since she's got her hands full with Brexit. But Corbyn, this would not take a lot of courage. He just would make a statement that it's unjust and criticize the British position, which politically would be very good, and help him in his candidacy to become the prime minister. And so I think you should write a letter to him and get any other friends of Julian to write a letter to him. Having been an elected official, I got to tell you, letters have an impact. Even if they get to staff, if the staff is turned on by the subject, like what you're talking about, his chief of staff is sympathetic, then the chief of staff will weigh in. And all of these things have an effect on, we're all human, regardless of what level of society we're at. And when people just keep gnawing at you to do something, it has effect. And so I think that getting a letter off to him and getting a couple of your friends who share your views on Assange to get a letter off to him and say, look at this, we're not asking a lot. We're just asking that in one of your speeches, you just make a statement that this is a ridiculous position for the British government to take. And it erodes freedom. And we're for freedom. So if you would do
that's a good idea. That is actually a good idea. You know, that to get a letter to him, and you know, he could just make a statement in Parliament. I mean, and that would have a big.
One paragraph he could do it in Parliament, and that'd be the end of it. And it won't hurt his career. It'll help his career. Okay.
That's interesting you say that. When the political calculation he's making is whether that would help him electorally or not. He could also ask her, the prime minister, during question time. Wouldn't that be a spectacle?
That's right.
If he asked her about freeing Julian Assange.
Yeah, that's exactly when he should do it, because that's his job, to ask difficult questions during the course of the Q&A. So.
Absolutely. Simon, do you want to jump in here? You're patiently waiting in the corner there. Another muted guest.
Mute.
Talking about censorship. Okay, here we go.
Okay, no censorship now. I just want to add on this point regarding this whole conceptualization of the political situation. I think we need to bear in mind all the time that politics is mostly theatre, and when it comes to trying to mentally psychoanalyze the various players, I think that's always a danger. We should always err on the side of assuming possibilities. And I'll give you an example. For instance, Assange is probably one of the most demonized people that's ever existed. But certainly Gaddafi would come close if he wasn't, if he didn't actually pip him to the post. But there was a time, going back a few years, when Gaddafi was suddenly resurrected, and Tony Blair was talking up Gaddafi, and I can't remember exactly what the context was. There was some role that he had to play back on the world stage, and they just overnight they just turned his image around, because nobody who, everybody who was calling him such a terrible guy, and frankly he obviously was, didn't really care about that. It was about politics. And there were a few other, so that's just a minor comment there on a general approach. But specifically with regard to this issue, George Brandis, the High Commissioner in Australia, Australian High Commissioner in London, Greg Barnes, one of Assange's lawyers, who's been on the Vigils a couple of times, had quite some interesting things to say about Brandis, and also the former Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, and Julie Bishop, his Foreign Minister. Now, those two have been replaced recently. We have Scott Morrison now as Prime Minister of Australia, and now I momentarily lapsed on the name of our current Foreign Minister. But Greg was emphasising that there is actually quite some depth of sympathy in those three people, including the High Commissioner. But the way that the theatre is being carried on politically and through the media has meant that they actually haven't done anything. Okay, Maurice Payne, Kathy just told me, the Foreign Minister of Australia currently, is quite right. Get back on my track. Yes, Greg Barnes was saying there's actually quite some depth of sympathy for Assange, but because of the climate, there was no actual positive action taken. But it was quite distinctive for that whole period. There was nothing negative said by the Liberal Party about Australia, about Assange. Now, in the current circumstance, the government of Australia, the Liberal Party, is facing an election shortly in Australia and is not in a very good position. Likewise, Theresa May in the UK is not in a very good position. Now, they speak very dismissively of Assange, and recently Steve Ciobo, the Foreign Minister, sorry, not Foreign Minister, the Minister for Defence in Australia, made some very disparaging comments about Assange. But that was actually only occasion in the last however many years, maybe 5 or 6 years, that there's been any statement from a high-ranking politician in Australia about Assange at all, that I recall. And
it's a strategy there to ignore him, I would imagine.
I think it is, because there are very significant issues here. They're very deep, and it mostly depends on ignoring the situation, because you can only double down so far with a ridiculous position, I think, before it blows up in your face. And I think a lot of that just depends on the conversation starting. And I think, for instance, the various Australian figures that have come on recently on the Vigil, like Tony Kevin and Andrew Fowler, very senior Australian journalist, and also Arthur here today, the senator. I think to break the silence might be all that's needed to have a major turn in the nature of the media climate. Now, we got some very significant forces we're up against, which is quite obvious, but it's a volatile situation, and the fact that the media constantly has such a negative presentation of the matter doesn't necessarily give a true indication of the political situation, the underlying political situation, when you take into account public opinion, the potential for public opinion to change, the actual underlying issues, the legality of the situation. Because anybody who's looked into it knows full well that the UN, the UK, is violating their own ratified human rights law, and just a comment by Corbyn in Parliament could swing it. A significant article in a newspaper could swing it. And we need to remember that the politicians and journalists are a bit the same in this regard. They often have, try to have a coherent face and present things and talk with a straight face when they say ridiculous things, but they can be amenable to reason, and they might have some sympathies themselves, which get called on and change their tenor and their line.
They might rehabilitate Muammar Gaddafi, because Blair in particular it's been pointed out, was trying to save him right up to the bombing of Libya, because they had been in talks about British companies getting into Libyan oil.
Right.
Then there was the issue of getting Gaddafi to give up his weapons of mass destruction deal.
Yes.
And when he did that, he became a darling of the West. He was somehow no longer the horrible man he was. So as you're absolutely right in pointing out, it's just expediency in politics. But then suddenly he was a man they wanted to kill, and they had him killed. So I don't see, frankly, where anything that Assange could do could help the interest, powerful interest. He's
okay. I'm not trying to swing it that way. Although I could suggest that because the Liberal Party in Australia is a sinking ship, if it realises it might actually be able to rehabilitate its image by getting on the right side of history in the wagon here. That's a possibility. Likewise in England. But also another thing is that with respect to political moves in this regard, they don't have to be flashy. Assange is weighing on Britain's prestige. The fact that they're treating him like this, the fact that they're so obviously abusing human rights in the centre of London, they pretend to ignore that. They pretend that's not a problem, but it does actually wear on their international image. And if they can just get rid of him, if they can just say, okay, we'll deport him to Australia, we're sick of him, they might be interested in that. I think there's various ways to add up. It's quite obvious.
Joe, if I might...
could I excuse myself? I've got a conference call that I've got to get on.
Yes.
So I'd like to excuse myself and thank everybody for participating in the program. So
thank you. We thank you, Mike. We thank you for your input.
It's an honor to meet you, Mike.
Okay.
Yes, thank you, Mike.
If I may respond to one thing that Simon said.
Simon says.
Yes. Look, we make the assumption, and we probably blame politicians because we think that they are aware of Julian's situation, but politicians read the papers too. And a lot of them form, and a lot of them don't read everything that comes through Parliament or backstories, particularly about Julian Assange. So you have a lot of politicians who get their information from the media. I think this is true in Australia, and John Pilger has complained about the Australian media, calling it Vichy journalism, but also he has complained about Guardian journalism in the UK, which is particularly bad. So you have this vicious circle happening, where if papers publish lies or misconceptions because they too are not well enough informed, then the politicians form their opinion on the basis of what they've read in the papers. So I think we need to throw it back to journalists to and hammer them with the facts about Julian's situation, because if his status as a journalist were actually made widely known rather than as a hacker or a whistleblower, then politicians might form a very, very different opinion. One of the reasons that none want to touch him is because they share these misconceptions. But we see politicians like Tony Kevin who, becoming aware, of course, he became aware a very long time ago when he saw the collateral murder video. But, a lot of them, once they become aware of the facts, then they stand up. Julian, about, I think it was 2011, did a great speech in London and one of his most famous quotes were, "If wars can be started by lies, then peace can be started by truth." So that's all I wanted to say about
Kathy,
that.
But it's also interesting that...
Yes, go ahead, George.
Yeah, it's interesting that as far as the official British position is concerned, the position of the Theresa May's government is that the only reason that they intend to arrest Julian Assange is that he skipped bail. They have never accused him of being a Russian spy. They've never accused him of being, of working for Putin. That's something that's the Americans, the American politicians, and the American journalists have gone in for. Even the British journalists, I mean, they've been very nasty about him and in a very personal way, but they've never gone as far as the way American journalists have in claiming that he's working for the Russians, that WikiLeaks is just simply an agent of the Russian government. So I think there is a room to say, well, look, if the only thing that you've got against him is your claim that he jumped bail, then for heaven's sake, the man's been locked up for 6 years. Don't you think he's already been punished, 1 million times over for this terrible sin? So of course, I mean, there's something going on in the background, of course, the pressure from the Americans, but none of this has ever been acknowledged by the British. The Theresa May government is still that, he's jumped bail and he cannot possibly evade the consequences of his actions by jumping bail.
Well, that's an interesting point, George. I wanted to ask Arthur a question, but before that, just to illustrate something that Kathy was saying about politicians read the paper. When I wrote the book with Mike Gravel back in 2008, we wrote a book together, and Daniel Ellsberg wrote the forward. So and because it was very much about the Pentagon Papers, because Ellsberg gave the papers to Gravel to read in the Congress, I interviewed Dan a few times, and he told me that he initially wanted senators to read it. He eventually found Gravel. He brought the Pentagon Papers to various people in the U.S. Senate, and they all turned him down. And his idea was that he discovered that he thought that if the politicians acted, it would then be in the newspapers. But he discovered it was the other way around. He had to put it in the newspapers first to get the senators to act. So that's why he went to the New York Times and the Washington Post with it. And then eventually, when they were stopped by the government against the law and with prior restraint, is when Ellsberg went to Gravel, and Gravel read the papers in a congressional subcommittee hearing, and they were on the record. And he used a clause in the U.S. Constitution that allows any member of the House or Senate to do whatever they want, say whatever they want in the middle of a legislative act, and they can't be questioned for it. So you can declassify anything you want in a public hearing in the U.S. Congress and not be arrested for that under that clause. But Arthur, I wanted to ask you, Simon pointed out that the Liberal Party is in trouble and that their fortunes could be improved by championing Julian Assange. That would very much depend on the mood of the voters in Australia about Assange. Do you have any insight into that? What kind of support does he have amongst Australian people? Is there any way to know this anyway?
Well, yeah, very hard to know all those sort of questions. Of course, once you start working with a pro-Assange group, you kind of move out of the mainstream. What do the non-Assange pro people think? Because you've moved into groups and talked to people all the time about him. So you think I would say, to be blunt, he's dropped out of consciousness a lot in the news cycle. And Kathy's doing a good job trying to keep him up there with 2 seminars she's done and one you're coming to. But yeah, he has kind of fallen off the radar a bit, and he's seen as, you know, that old guy from a long time ago who did some good then and now has bad teeth. You know, it's very Simon's dead right that the Liberal Party's in appalling trouble here. It's been infiltrated, I would think, systematically by the conservative religious groups for a long time. That had not been evident, but once they started to do policy stuff, it became much too evident. And Australia is one of the least religious countries in the world. We're proud of that. And I think that has scored against them quite a lot in their highly conservative views. Now, whether that element of the sort of paradox of the conservative who's concerned about the individual and thus becomes something of an advocate for human rights, that hasn't happened. But there are certainly elements in the Liberal Party, which, as I say, is headed for the biggest landslide defeat, I would say, probably in Australian political history. I could be wrong on that, but it'll be of massive proportions. And there's a state election in New South Wales, our biggest state, at the end of March, and then a federal election scheduled for May. So from the Liberals' point of view, the issue is particularly urgent at present. So, yeah, I mean, Simon's idea is not a bad idea if there's a bit of a push to say to Liberals, look, you know, do you care about civil rights? I think the Australian ambassador to the US is Downer, who made a whole lot of statements when he first went into Parliament about how concerned he was about individual and human rights. His government didn't go on to do much about it, but he made, of course, when there wasn't an acute issue, as it were, at the time, it's fine to be pro-human rights when there's no actual issue you've got to put your name on the line for. You know, I mean, it's easy to do the talk when you're starting your political career and blowing your whistle. But of course, when the time came, the Liberals were pretty hopeless on Assange's human rights. But I mean, Simon's right. It's worth a bash, that's for sure.
You have nothing to lose, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
I want to bring in Brian Becker from Loud and Clear, and I think John Kiriakou said he would join us too, which is Brian's co-host on that show. Brian, we've been talking about a number of issues, one being the City Council, or they call the Parliament of Geneva, having voted on Wednesday to ask the federal government of Switzerland to give political asylum to Assange. That spurred a debate then about the whole initiative process versus referenda. And we had Senator Mike Gravel on, and that's his life's work after leaving the Senate, is to try to create a national initiative, because we have them in 26 states in the U.S., but we don't have it in a way where the people can do initiatives to force the federal government to do something. And now we've veered off into Australian politics because we've got 3 Aussies on the line right now. So that was inevitable, I guess. And I'm about to go to Australia, so I'm listening very intently, because I confess I'm not really boned up on Australian politics, but I hope to learn a lot when I go down there. Brian, just weigh in on any of that or anything else you'd like to say about what's been going on. Also, I mentioned that WikiLeaks again has been tweeting about this 2008 document, a manual for overthrowing governments for regime change that WikiLeaks obtained and published. And in it, it talks about the IMF and the World Bank being, and these are the actual words in this document, weapons to fight a society, basically, to bring down a government. So they're using 2 banks, the IMF and the World Bank, 2 major international financial institutions, for political purposes, not their intentions at all. And I thought maybe since you're involved in the Venezuelan issue, and that's the reason WikiLeaks has put it out, they may want to comment on that.
Yeah, hi, Joe, and hello to everybody. Yeah, I'm much more available to talk on that than certainly Australia politics, although I am curious and do want to listen to it. Yeah, the document that WikiLeaks released, they call it the U.S. coup manual. That's not its official name, of course, but it's the Army Special Operations Forces Unconventional Warfare booklet. In some ways, it doesn't say anything that people who are carefully observing or have carefully observed U.S. foreign policy wouldn't know. But the importance of the document is that most of the population doesn't know and won't know if they're getting most of their information from the corporate-owned media, that the United States does this tried and true trick, which is to use, of course, the IMF and the World Bank and economic sanctions and third-party sanctions and embargoes and blockades and every myriad form of economic warfare to, in the words of Henry Kissinger, make an economy scream, as a precursor to the overthrow of that government, either by covert operations or by overt military operations, or both. In order to carry out these kind of coup d'etats, which we see unfolding in the most brazen way in the case of Venezuela, but which happened in a little less brazen way in other places, say in Iran, in particular in 1953, after the Mossadegh government nationalized the Anglo-Iranian oil company, now known as BP, or what happened to Allende in September 11th, 1973, and the lead up to that. In both cases, the US government, using financial institutions, corporate power, banking power, its allies in Europe, exerted so much pressure on the economy that parts of the population, in particular the middle class, which is less accustomed to enduring day-to-day economic hardships than the poor, who always suffer them and aren't that surprised by them, as they become more discontented, the political material, the human material that goes along with and is used frequently as a pretext to justify the covert operation, that it's not just old-style 19th century colonialism coming in to loot, plunder, and pillage, but it's actually American intelligence organizations and US government agencies and the Pentagon coming in to rescue a part of the population that's suffering. So it's this playbook that is used over and over again, impose extreme economic pressure, extreme, and then become the champions of the people as they rise up in their discontent against the government that's unable to solve the economic problems. And the reason it's important, again, is, those of us who have been following these things do know it, but most people are not going back. Most people are not going back to read the history of what happened in 1953 in Iran or in 1973 in Chile. They don't know. And so this becomes an extremely valuable document. I'm working, as you might know, Joe, and have been working every day to build mass actions in the United States opposing the Trump administration's coup efforts in Venezuela. And on March 16th, Saturday, March 16th, people from all over the United States are coming together at the White House around 4 demands: U.S. hands off Venezuela, no to the coup, no to sanctions, and no to a new U.S. military intervention or war. The thing that we most need, the thing that's most needed by the grassroots movement, is information like the information contained in this booklet that WikiLeaks has made available, because we're basically in a fight for ideas. A lot of people, including people who would generally have been against the Iraq War, have been certainly against the Vietnam War, probably are, at least in retrospect, against the coup in Chile or in Iran in 1953. They're very, very confused because the mainstream media is just pouring out all of this misinformation to prepare the population to accept any new American aggression. And so the biggest problem we have is when we go out and talk to students on campuses, or when we're going to churches and synagogues or mosques or community meetings, people just think actually the real problem in Venezuela is Maduro, not recognizing that whatever problems of corruption or mismanagement that exist in Caracas, and they exist in any country, Venezuela is basically a one commodity country. It's oil. Oil prices dropped precipitously in the last 10 years. The U.S., which has been trying to overthrow the government for the last 20 years, has taken advantage of it to impose very harsh economic sanctions, again, right straight out of this Army manual playbook, in order to weaken the regime, weaken the government, and make it more vulnerable, or at least lose parts of the population to popular discontent. So yeah, this is important, again, because we need talking points. We need to counter the ideas that are coming from the mainstream corporate media with other ideas. And the ideas have to be based on facts, and they have to be persuasively presented. And I think what WikiLeaks has done here, again, is provide people with the actual factual material that exposes governments and allows those of us who are organizers and activists to take this kind of information, bundle it, promote it, and use it as a way to counter the dominant narrative as it impacts Venezuela. So again, it just says so much. I mean, everything WikiLeaks has published is true. None of it is untrue. This army booklet is a real thing, but we wouldn't be talking about it except for the fact that WikiLeaks took the time to go through it, look at it, assess it, and also to release it. And a lot of other derivative articles are appearing now, at least in alternative media, based on this publication.
On alternative media. So it's no accident that the corporate media doesn't give the history that you referred to before, like Iran in 53 or Arbenz in Guatemala, or certainly Allende 73. That's done, I think, purposely. There's a hole, a memory hole, where history is just disappeared, and there's no context for the people of the United States, the readers and the viewers, to understand that this is not something new, that there's a long history of this in the US. You know, it reminds me of what Winston Smith was doing, of course, in 1984. His job was to go into the archives of the Times of London and change things so that if anybody went back and looked it up, you know, they wouldn't be able to point out that the government was lying or that they promised something they didn't do. And here we have history every day being eliminated from the press. And WikiLeaks, as you say, steps into that breach. Yes, George?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's ancient history, such as the overthrow of Mossadegh and the overthrow of Allende. So it's ancient history that is ignored, but even more recent history that is ignored. I mean, the reports about Venezuela simply don't even mention the sanctions that the United States have been imposing for the last 5 years. They just don't mention it. So instead, it becomes an object lesson in the failure of socialism. Venezuela is in turmoil because socialism has failed. As if somehow, you know, everything that the US has been doing for the past 5 years, that's just simply just disappeared. You know, no one even mentions it. It's just Venezuela just had the socialist experiment and, oh, it failed.
And guess what? When it starts to succeed and they can't overturn it by sanctions, they will empower a fascistic military like in Chile to actually kill the president in the presidential palace and institute then the Chicago School economics, what we now know as neoliberalism, or a new laissez-faire, where you take government out, you privatize. And a big instrument of that has been the IMF and the World Bank. And I think prior to that, the IMF actually wasn't necessarily used that way. There was a movement called developmentalism, of course, in Latin America. And it was quite popular, particularly in the General Assembly of the UN and across the region, and that had to be stopped. And overthrowing Allende, a successful socialist politician who was making real social progress, that was really the test case, in my view, to get him out and put in one of the most odious regimes that you can imagine in Chile. And then all those Chicago School guys came down from Chicago and started running the economic policy of Chile. And we don't hear about that. And as you're absolutely point, we don't hear about what's going on now, let alone what happened 30, 40, 50 years ago. But I argue that the press, if it's doing its job, would give that historical context repeatedly, because there's no other way to understand what the U.S. is doing. This is not something, even the Abrams, Elliot Abrams being back on the scene as the envoy to Venezuela, there's nothing in the corporate press about what that I've seen about what his history has been in Latin America.
Yes, exactly. I mean, the 1980s, I mean, this is already 30 years ago. I mean, you couldn't pick up a paper back then, without reading something about what Elliot Abrams was up to. I mean, the horrors of Guatemala and El Salvador, Nicaragua. Elliot Abrams was right in the thick of this. And then he comes back, and you think that, hey, this should be causing some outrage everywhere, that you're bringing by this guy, and then this guy is the one who's going to be your point man on Venezuela. It's amazing. In fact, it's just an extraordinary lacuna in the media coverage.
I remember when Negroponte, who was really the guy who had the dirtiest hands maybe in El Salvador and Honduras, became the UN ambassador, and I was posted as a correspondent at the UN, and a few of us asked him a little bit about that past, and then he just danced around it, and that was the end of it. He was then the US ambassador to the United Nations, and he was a respected and legitimate figure. And that's the same with this Abrams. He's being rehabilitated, and it's shocking. That
and I don't know whether, and you remember William Walker, who was the US ambassador to El Salvador, who was whitewashed all the crimes that went on in El Salvador, then reappeared in the 90s as this great human rights warrior in Kosovo. And he would, burst into tears at, my God, these atrocities taking place in Kosovo. I've never seen such a thing. This is a guy who was just simply, kill a whole bunch of nuns. He said, well, I don't know, who knows who's responsible? These things happen. And now suddenly he's just posing as this human rights warrior. So it's,
another example of the failure of the press, the corporate press, is just today, Sam Husseini, who's been on our vigils before, who was at the State Department. He has credentials, and Elliot Abrams showed up, and he was getting softball questions. They were calling on, I guess, the favorite correspondents, and he started yelling out questions from the back of the room. Now that is, having been in hundreds of press conferences, that is really a no-no, but he couldn't resist. And he started asking him about those criminal activities of Abrams' past, and it was ignored, and he was reprimanded, Sam was, by the press office in the State Department for having broken protocol by yelling out those questions. Now, what the questions were, they didn't make a point of that, but of course that had a lot to do with it. Sam here, I'm in the press club right here in Washington, and Sam was suspended here because of questions that he asked of al-Turki, who was the head of the Saudi intelligence. They didn't like the questions he asked, and he was suspended for that. It's just an extraordinary. This is where WikiLeaks is so damn important, because it's doing what the corporate media is not doing. What?
Wasn't Sam Husseini, wasn't he thrown out of some kind of a press conference? I seem to remember that.
That was also not just some kind of press conference. It was the Trump-Putin press conference in Helsinki. Sam went in there with credentials from The Nation magazine. And again, this is not something that's normally done. But when you want to ask a question, you raise your hand and you hope to be called on. And very often you're not. You leave disappointed. But Sam wrote on a piece of paper, nuclear test ban treaty, because he wanted to ask about that. But it was misinterpreted as he was going to protest. So I remember tuning in live to watch this press conference, and the camera zoomed in, and I saw Sam in a headlock. They were dragging him out of this press conference. Yeah.
Can I come back to the point
you can.
On economic war?
Yes.
I recently visited Argentina and Chile and went to the museums they have there of the disappeared, shall we say. And they're both in both those museums, they're concerned that the government's turning right and there'll be not much respect for human rights, and the politics goes from one extreme, the left, to the right. It doesn't sort of have a center in the terms of power so much. And they feel, I think, because a lot of them are dependent on one or two commodities for their entire economy, but they are very, very vulnerable. And the US manipulates economic policy to control South America. That's the perception down there, I think. That was the vibe I got. And certainly seeing what they're doing in Venezuela. I mean, that war has started years ago, of course, and now it's reaching the media when they've actually picked the guy to be the new head, and the vice president is simply sort of, the Russian media, of course, were very sarcastic about it. They said he just sort of announced he was going to be president and then sort of disappeared so he wouldn't get in trouble with the existing police and the existing establishment. But the idea has never been sort of pushed by even the alternative media that these economic wars go on for years, and then they're painted as, this incompetent socialist government proves that socialism can't work, which is what George was saying. And that's exactly right. But when Maduro's troubles would be, you don't see any economic analysis saying, well, how much of Maduro's troubles are Maduro's and how much of it is the US fiddling with oil and fiddling with prices and so on. This idea that the US would sell goods in the other countries would sell in non-US dollars and thus break the US dollar's strength based on the world oil market is very pervasive in terms of what happened in Iraq, Iran, Libya, and now Venezuela. And of course, the Chinese are trying to push the yuan up there and may succeed. Ideally, I suppose there'd be a basket of currencies so that no single currency would be dominant, favouring the country that had that currency. But I mean, it does upset me that the analyses of wars and of politics generally don't talk about these economic policies. I guess they're a bit too sophisticated, but it's really quite critical in terms of the Venezuela situation. And the other point, I think, is that we talk about this fantastic WikiLeaks document, but this is it in practice. This is what actually happens. This is not a theory manual. This is happening. You've got the manual. You've got it happening in front of your very eyes, and the link is not being made
because it's not in the big media. It's ignoring it.
But it's not even in the little media mostly, is it?
Yeah,
there have been some
not even in the little media.
Brian, have you mentioned that on one of your shows? This document?
No, we haven't actually. I've been reading. Anyway, our show gets with all those different segments we do 2 hours a day. We've covered Venezuela a lot, but we haven't covered this document. We undoubtedly will in the coming period. I did want to say that, occasionally something comes out in the mainstream media when things are not going well for the coup makers or the war makers, and then there's obviously some sort of second thinking or tactical reappraisal. And I thought it was interesting today that the Wall Street Journal on its front page had an article about the opposition in Venezuela's response to the startling announcement that Juan Guaido had become president of Venezuela. They were all there together on the rally stage that day. There was a big crowd, tens of thousands of people. The Wall Street Journal said maybe 100,000. And each of the opposition speakers was speaking. And then Juan Guaido got up and said, "I am now the new president of Venezuela." And the Wall Street Journal article, you could see it today. It's on the front page. All the other opposition leaders start looking at each other and they're like, what? What did he just say? None of them knew it. None of them knew it was coming. According to the Wall Street Journal, there were 4 people in Venezuela who knew that Juan Guaido was president in the moments before he announced it. One was Leopoldo Lopez, who's the leader of his party, Popular Will, who's a fascist who's in jail in Venezuela. The other 2 were 2 exiled opposition leaders, and then it was Juan Guaido. So obviously he had just had the call with Pence. Right. He comes out, he announces he's the president, and the article documents how all the other opposition leaders on the stage at the moment that he announces it leave the stage. They can't believe that this is unfolding in front of their eyes. And that's how Juan Guaido became president of Venezuela. He and 3 other people, 2 of whom were out of the country and the other in prison, knew that he was the new president. And here you have Canada and the rest of the Lima group and the EU acknowledging the legitimacy of Juan Guaido. And I think the reason the Wall Street Journal had the article is that the coup plan isn't going exactly according to plan. And I think there's a lot of weaknesses with the coup as a consequence of this kind of reckless absence of coup planning. The fact that it came about and Juan Guaido hasn't quickly assumed the office or the responsibilities of the office. That doesn't mean that the U.S. isn't going to go forward. The U.S. will go forward. And we can remember well how it wasn't going that well in the Libya war for the first couple months. Gaddafi seemed to have great popular support, massive demonstrations. They had to use military means to take his headquarters and to disperse the government. And I think what we're going to see now is the combination of the continued basic theft of Venezuelan resources, like the seizure by the UK of $1.2 billion of Venezuela's gold and handing it over to Juan Guaido, the U.S. seizure of their bank accounts and giving it to the opposition. But more importantly, I think what we will witness is the beginning of preparation, or the preparations are already underway for military action to oust Maduro. It may come in the form of a Colombia-Venezuela war. It may come through other covert operations. The coup's not going to go away, but it's not that successful yet. And I think that's why this little bit of truth came out today on the front page of the Wall Street Journal.
Did they mention the Pence call in that article, Brian?
They mentioned the Pence call,
Wow.
but it's later, it's further down. But can you imagine? Mike Pence calls this guy. Nobody knows that he has been told by Mike Pence that you are the next and new president of Venezuela. Anyway, it's kind of a useful piece that I think we need to also, those of us who care about justice in Venezuela, need to, sort of incorporate into our own sort of argumentation on this.
Nobody knew in Venezuela, and nobody knows how to pronounce his name in Washington.
Or even in the OAS. Even in the OAS, did you hear the Paraguay guy say, and we recognize Jose, what's his name? Is it Jose? No, it's Juan. It's Juan. And then his aides are heard telling him how to pronounce Guaido's name.
Yeah, Mike Pompeo called him Guido the first time, I think, which upset a lot of Italian Americans, I think. So this is just extraordinary, that story. I was not aware of that. Thanks for telling us about that. So that this is 4 people in Venezuela and a couple of hundred probably here in Washington knew that he was going to be
Elliot Abrams is one of them.
Oh, goodness. To have him brought in.
Interject at this point. I think this is an incredible. What we're witnessing here is surreal, and that's what's so distinctive about it, and why it's such a powerful thing to behold. And we can rally around it, and we can spread the message, and it gets out. And what I think is curious from this, I just want to draw it back to the broader principle, is that the theatre, the political theatre that operates, is largely shambolic. And this is a perfect example of it. And even the Wall Street Journal, you imagine, is supposed to be the regulator, one of the main regulators, like the New York Times, of the imperial narrative, is making it clear that there's anything but democracy that just triumphed there in Venezuela. And so while there is the imperial, for want of a better term, the imperial broad scenario that drives and controls most of the events, there's a core of that which we can't possibly ever influence. The money, there's certain people, Mike Pence, we can give up on him, right? But the Wall Street Journal, apparently we can't even give up on them. Sometimes they come good. So this is kind of what I'm saying. This, I wouldn't have, by raising the analogy between Gaddafi and Assange, I only meant to say that it's the superficie, the theatre can change dramatically and radically and unpredictably, chaotically. That's not to say that the driving powers change. They're often very constant, but often the actual political situations, taken as a whole, are very precarious and chaotic. And I think that applies as much with Assange as it does with Venezuela. And
indeed,
there can be moments where things can galvanize in an unpredictable direction that will finally change the course of the overall situation. I think we might be approaching something like that with Assange.
Hopefully. You're right. I'm on just about the Wall Street Journal, having been a correspondent for 6.5 years for the Wall Street Journal, having written for them. I wonder if what Brian is saying isn't the reason for that article being published, because I could tell many stories about how difficult it was for me to get certain articles in the paper, but that didn't fit the narrative that they were pushing and the agenda that the journal has, is that they see this as not going very well, as Brian says. So maybe this is a criticism of the Trump administration, that you guys can't even pull off a good coup. So you didn't tell anybody else except 4 people. So I wonder if that wasn't what, maybe the reporters had a different motive, that they thought this was a pretty good story and people should know this. And then the editors may, and I'm just speculating, but it's based on having worked for them for 6 years, that maybe they thought, well, we can really stick it to the administration. They're not doing it right. And we want them to get their act together and overthrow this government. I don't know, just something I threw out.
No, I think that's right. I don't think it's any moral outrage at U.S. policy. I mean, it's as Joe says. I mean, they just they say, hey, you don't know what the hell you're doing. If only you had some serious pros in charge. They'd know what to do.
Right.
I'm not complaining. I mean, if that's their attitude, that's great. We don't need perfect motives. We can take advantage of all kinds of stuff.
Might I give another example of the levee breaking somewhat on mainstream media and the effect that had? I'm just going to share my screen and show you. 1 second. Okay, here we go. So 60 Minutes, and this will be interesting to you, Arthur, as well. 60 Minutes is a mainstream media news channel, chat show type of thing, but they do special extended reports. Now, in fact, once the truth, this was when they invited Pamela Anderson on, once the truth about Julian came out, they launched a poll. It only lasted a few hours, but there were about 7,000 Australians that responded and gave their opinion as to whether Julian should be brought home to Australia. And in fact, the result, after hearing the facts, was that 91% of the Australian population said rescue Assange. So, I think it's interesting, Brian, that you said that journalists can be clueless. But I think just there in that tweet that I showed, it was Twitter handle called Operation Free Assange, and I salute them because that's our job. That's our job to keep letting them know what the truth is, and then finally, because there are so many of us, we will break the ice. Maybe journalists will start, instead of just being briefed by their superiors and half facts and politicians reading misinformation in the paper, suddenly if the truth breaks through and that goes out to the people, there is a very, very different reaction.
That might be a good way to bring this vigil to a close. We still have about 14 minutes. So if anyone wants to conclude with some remarks, Arthur, would you like to give us some concluding remarks, perhaps, about everything we've discussed?
Well, I was unaware of the survey on 60 Minutes, I must confess. I'm almost unaware that 60 Minutes is still on. It used to break the news and be pretty much an imperative. But since the commercialization of the media has become so, how do you say, it's as if the power of money in terms of content has increased grossly over the last 30 years. I mean, the media magnates used to stand back and say, well, as long as we're making the money from the advertising, you editorial guys do what you like. And I think that's absolutely no more the case. There's no money for investigative journalism, and there's no commitment to anything that rocks the ship now or might threaten revenues, and perhaps that's because it's more competitive, and that the whole economic model for conventional media, both the press and the conventional TV for doing it from advertising, is so much under threat from non-mainstream, content of Facebook and so on, that the pressure on them economically, and they're sacking journalists and so on. So it's not just news. It's every aspect of content is being damaged in this neoliberal commoditization, if you want to call it that, commodification of everything. A political party's a commodity. Airtime is a commodity, and human beings are a commodity for the health system. The commodification of all things has gone into the idea that anything that can make a profit has to, and journalists who aren't making a profit from what they say or who are disturbing somebody else making a profit are to be eliminated or destroyed, or certainly not supported. So this change in the models has resulted in a change in the resources, and this has not been addressed in Australia with the Conservative government, and particularly with the effects of Rupert Murdoch, who you'd know who from Fox News and so on over there. They're talking about privatising the ABC, which is a sort of the BBC model of the taxpayer funds independent journalism, which informs and challenges, in terms of its social function, and that is very much under threat. So I think we simply have to say, look, if we go back to what I'm saying, and without wanting to just repeat myself, the commodification of all things is a trend that's been going on sort of with neoliberalism since, the 80s, I guess. I'm not a historian. And that trend has to be reversed in all ways. And the more you identify the underlying driving philosophical, historical, and economic forces, the more you can then see all events within a broader context and actually start working effectively. And I think it's the neoliberalist commodification. I mean, I work in health, and now a human body and a human operation is a commodity. It's not a right anymore. Housing in Australia is an investment category, not a right. And as these things change from rights to commodities, of course, they will behave like every other commodity. Did you buy bananas or apples today? And I think if people come back and say, hang on, our news models are all broken, and until we get funding models that will support independent journalism and accept that there are certain rights, like the right to health, the right to housing, and the right to honest information, until we see our whole society in a new context, we're fighting our battles one at a time, and that's why we're being so ineffective. And I think a lot of activists I know have got burnout because they're trying to deal with 15 issues. And so I'm trying to get back to, well, what's the fundamental problem that's causing all these other things? Are these all manifestations of a common problem? And I would say the commodification of everything.
Are you we frozen? You're frozen. So I just wanted to, you're unfrozen. I just wanted to, I liked what you said about what's happened, especially at the TV news. In the old days, it was that the entertainment division would be able to support the news division. News division was expected to lose money, but they got their money from entertainment side. And in the wonderfully prescient film Network of 1976, it shows how the entertainment division would take over the news. That was a radical, ridiculous idea then. And that's exactly what pretty much has happened, because TV news in the US, in any case, is entertainment. It's about the star presenter, not about the news anymore. You can go back to YouTube and look at 1970s US network broadcast, and there was real news there, and the guy was just reading it. And they usually had some kind of background as a reporter, wire service reporter. So it's really greed over public service is what's driven this. We have our own, we had 60 Minutes here too. Probably the Australian one was modeled on that. And that was a very serious news program too when it began many, many years ago, and has also lost its importance and its seriousness in many ways. Let's move on to George, and then Brian, Simon, and Kathy. So George, final words.
Well, final words. There's no question that what we have now in journalism is essentially a kind of a few celebrity figures who are not really practicing journalism. They're just simply pundits spouting opinions. And that's where the resources of journalism go. I mean, if we looked at the New York Times, they're laying off people at the same time as they're paying, gargantuan salaries to somebody like Thomas Friedman. And why are they doing this? I mean, they're doing this because Thomas Friedman is presenting a view of the world that the New York Times once presented, and so I think that model of journalism that we used to have, which is a reporter digs around for news and tries to find out as much as possible. That's kind of already gone. There just isn't the money for that. It's the celebrities. It's you're trying to sell a product.
That's right. And the guy who is doing it, they want to throw in jail. Yes,
exactly. And what is so shocking? I mean, it's like coming over here. I just did a quick Google search, and I just put what comes up if you mention Julian Assange, and it's just a relentless series of attacks. But the attacks aren't even coming from the governments. You think governments don't like him? Why wouldn't they? I mean, it's embarrassing for what he does. But the attacks, the most vicious, deceitful, lying attacks, all come from journalists. And from reputable publications. I look at something at the New Yorker, something from the Atlantic, the Daily Beast, Slate, Salon. The most vicious, ridiculous, lying attacks all come from people who are described as journalists. And that really does tell you something about where we are today.
Well, he's holding up a light to them and showing them that they're not doing their job.
Exactly.
And he is. And again, there's a loss of this idea of public service, so that they would let the networks let news had to stand whether it lost money or not, because the public, it was a service to the public. That is totally gone, and we see it surviving in WikiLeaks. That's what its mission is. Brian, yes. We've got a few minutes left.
I want to quote Karl Marx. Yeah. So when Karl Marx was just 25, he wrote, the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. The class, which is the ruling material force of society, is at the same time its ruling intellectual force.
The German ideology.
And you knew
I know that quote. I know the quote. I've read the book. I loved it.
By the way, Marx lost that pamphlet. He couldn't find the manuscript. Engels was really mad at him, and it was only found in his attic after he died. And
wow, I didn't know that.
He was explaining to Engels that he shouldn't be disappointed because it was mainly for self-clarification anyway.
One of the great things that they wrote. Mm-hmm.
But it's an important concept, and I think it kind of goes to what WikiLeaks has done because of the technology of the internet and the capacity for whistleblowing and the release of documents that counters the ruling class narrative in a way that's much more powerful than in earlier epochs. Even in, it would have been inconceivable in Marx's day that an anti-government, or let's not call it anti-government, a truth-telling agency or media outlet like WikiLeaks could have such a profound global impact in such a short amount of time. And I think it's perceived as almost like a graver threat to the ruling establishment than the armed forces, say, of Al-Qaeda or terrorist organizations that have used violent methods against the government, because unlike Al-Qaeda, which can do some amount of damage, its ideas are not actually threatening to the ideas of the ruling order. I mean, they're in some ways an anomaly. They're in some ways manipulatable. But Julian Assange and WikiLeaks as an agency, by telling the truth over and over again, has the effect of empowering people who want justice, who in this day and age expect that there should be transparency, who in this day and age want their government to be accountable, who in this day and age actually, even though they may have become cynical, believe that there could be something called democracy, the rule of the people. But in order to have that happen, the people need the information and not have it all be closeted away, kept in secret vaults. And so that's why I think that accounts for this virulent assault against Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, But all the more reason why these vigils are important, why what you're doing, Joe, is important, why all the other real core activists who have done so much for so long to support freedom for Julian Assange. Again, we're trying to reach people. We're trying to empower people, just as WikiLeaks itself, as a media outlet, has done so much to empower people in general and social justice movements in particular. So that's my final comment. I think this is a historic kind of battle, really. We're in a new era, new technologies available. This is kind of a test case of whether truth tellers can prevail or whether they'll be ground down by the coercive power of state repression and state violence. And in that sense, everybody, regardless of where you're coming from philosophically, has a stake in the outcome.
Well, Brian, that's brilliant. Thank you very much for that and for joining us. We've actually come to 7 p.m. here on the East Coast of the U.S., but I do promise Simon and Kathy a last word. If you could limit it to a minute each, it would be great. And thank you again, Brian.
Shall I go first?
No, Simon. We'll have ladies last. Ladies last, yes. Well, Simon's muted, so you can go first, Kathy.
Okay. Very quickly.
You blew it, Simon. Okay.
Very quickly. You said that I was going to just provide a few more details about what's happening next week. So in Sydney, we have the WikiLeaks event, Whistleblowing and WikiLeaks, the future of democracy. This is a wide debate about the future of democracy and why WikiLeaks is important. I think we've talked a lot about that today. So if I don't need to go into that again. So these are the guests we have. James Cogan from the Socialist Equality Party. We missed him last time, but we're sure he's going to be here this time. Myself, Kate, the wonderful independent journalist who can really give us the truth. Caitlin Johnson from Melbourne. Our very own former ambassador, Tony Kevin from Canberra. And Joe Laurier. Joe, you let the cat out of the bag. So, well, okay, well, I might as well announce it. In fact, Joe Laurier is going to be with us in Sydney. And my final word about, to all of our whether you are just an ordinary supporter, a member of the public, a journalist, someone with money, don't get cynical, get active. And we have to help WikiLeaks keep the historical record straight.
Thank you, Kathy. Simon, you want to say goodbye?
Okay, thank you. I'd just like to, add actually, I intend to be there myself as well, to Kathy as a man. With respect to this overarching concern about, where is the power? Do we have any power? Is it hopeless? Is it, there are perspectives from either side of that spectrum have often been raised here on the Vigil over time. And I only want to add just one thing, is we often don't look forward so much. And I wonder, where are the tech people here? Because as we said, technology has made such a difference between that usual dynamic where power controls the intellectual scene and the narrative. We've had disturbance in that. We've had a lot of disturbance that's resulted in things like Trump's presidency, Brexit, Frontier Vests, all kinds of stuff. But there was a lot of optimism when the internet first started out and the social media started getting going. And I think there's been a lot of disillusionment with the rise of Twitter and Facebook, and we see the dystopic aspects of it and the Atlantic Council censorship and all this kind of stuff. But I still think we're heading in the right direction. We'll get there eventually. We need to, I think, and actually WikiLeaks tweeted some months ago an article about somebody had written about Web3, which is a next iteration of technological possibilities for disseminating information and And WikiLeaks, it was an optimistic article, and that suggested that WikiLeaks was optimistic about it in some respects. So I'd like to encourage some tech people to get front and center here and come on and start talking about some possibilities. Things are in the pipeline, things are being developed. For instance, we're having some trouble ourselves with the website several months now, failing to launch the version 2 of the website. But there's things that have been going on in the works with a view to being able to communicate, to draw together various people to supply information and produce journalistic content, which is the type of journalistic content that we need.
That's exactly right. And I think that's a good way to end it, that we need to be a little bit more optimistic sometimes, because you never know what's going to happen. So let me thank everyone who joined us. There were Fikri earlier from the Gian Journal, and we had Senator Mike Gravel, and of course, George from New York. Is that where you are, George?
At the moment, yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and we have former local parliamentarian Arthur, who's speaking to us from where? Where are you? Oh, well, you're muted, so we're not going to find that out. Kathy coming from Sydney, Brian Becker from here in Washington, D.C., and I'm Joe Loria, the editor-in-chief of Consortium News, and I thank everybody for joining us today, our guests and our viewers, and I will be speaking to you next Friday from Sydney. Goodbye, everyone.
Okay, bye.
All right, thank you, Arthur, for joining us. And Brian, you were terrific again. Thank you for coming on, and we had a pretty good discussion.
Thanks for
today.
doing it, Joe. Really, really important.
Yeah, it is historic. You're absolutely right, and that's not an exaggeration. It's not hyperbole. It is an historic press freedom case, and that's why I'm involved. So,
Are we out?
We're out. I hope we're out.
Oh, thank you.
When were we out?
Yeah.
Oh, great. Okay, thank you.
I was worried.
Right. I just want to.
I gotta go. I gotta go to the men's room where I gotta go. So carry on speaking. Yes.
Arthur, thank you so much. You were wonderful.
Thank you, Kathy. What a wonderful opinion you have.
And you dodged that question quite well about being an advocate for WikiLeaks, because it's not exactly at the center of your field, but you said, well, I haven't got so much.
Kitty, we still appear to be live, eh?
Oh. Goodness gracious. Let me just check as well.
I'll take your word for it. I'm a technophobe.
I don't think anyone said anything terrible, did we?
Oh, no, but sometimes people say things that are really off the record when they think that.
You can thank me on the record much as you like.
Yeah, that's right. But I can confirm we are still going live to air.
Oh, okay.
I just heard Arthur say he was a technophobe.